In these times of ours, though concerning the exact year there is no need to be precise, a boat of dirty and disreputable appearance, with 2 figures in it, floated on the Thames between Southwark Bridge, which is of iron, and London Bridge, which is of stone, as an autumn evening was closing in. The figures in this boat were those of a strong man with ragged grizzled hair and a sun-browned face, and a dark girl of 19 or 20, sufficiently like him to be recognizable as his daughter. The girl rowed, pulling a pair of sculls very easily. The man with the rudder lines slack in his hands, and his hands loose in his waistband, kept an eager lookout. He had no net, hook, or line, and he could not be a fisherman. His boat had no cushion for a sitter, no paint, no inscription, no appliance beyond a rusty boat-hook and a coil of rope. And he could not be a waterman. His boat was too crazy and too small to take in cargo for delivery. And he could not be a lighterman, or river carrier. There was no clue to what he looked for, but he looked for something with a most intent and searching gaze. The tide, which had turned an hour before, was running down, and his eyes watched every little race and eddy in its broad sweep as the boat made slight headway against it, or drove stern foremost before it, according as he directed his daughter by a movement of his head. She watched his face as earnestly as he watched the river, but in the intensity of her look there was a touch of dread or horror. Allied to the bottom of the river rather than the surface, by reason of the slime and ooze with which it was covered, and its sodden state, this boat and the 2 figures in it obviously were doing something that they often did, and were seeking what they often sought. Half savage as the man showed, with no covering on his matted head, with his brown arms bare to between the elbow and the shoulder, with the loose knot of a looser kerchief lying low on his bare breast in a wilderness of beard and whisker, with such dress as he wore seeming to be made out of the mud that begrimed his boat, still there was a business-like usage in his steady gaze. So with every lithe action of the girl, with every turn of her wrist, perhaps most of all with her look of dread or horror, they were things of usage. "Keep her out, Lizzie. Tide runs strong here. Keep her well afore the sweep of it." Trusting to the girl's skill, and making no use of the rudder, he eyed the coming tide with an absorbed attention. So the girl eyed him. But it happened now that a slant of light from the setting sun glanced into the bottom of the boat, and, touching a rotten stain there which bore some resemblance to the outline of a muffled human form, coloured it as though with diluted blood. This caught the girl's eye, and she shivered. "What ails you?" said the man, immediately aware of it, though so intent on the advancing waters. "I see nothing afloat." The red light was gone, the shudder was gone, and his gaze, which had come back to the boat for a moment, travelled away again. Wheresoever the strong tide met with an impediment, his gaze paused for an instant. At every mooring chain and rope, at every stationary boat or barge that split the current into a broad arrowhead, at the offsets from the piers of Southwark Bridge, at the paddles of the river steamboats as they beat the filthy water, at the floating logs of timber lashed together lying off certain wharves, his shining eyes darted a hungry look. After a darkening hour or so, suddenly the rudder lines tightened in his hold, and he steered hard towards the Surrey shore. Always watching his face, the girl instantly answered to the action in her sculling. Presently the boat swung round, quivered as from a sudden jerk, and the upper half of the man was stretched out over the stern. The girl pulled the hood of a cloak she wore over her head and over her face, and, looking backward so that the front folds of this hood were turned down the river, kept the boat in that direction, going before the tide. Until now the boat had barely held her own, and had hovered about one spot, but now the banks changed swiftly, and the deepening shadows and the kindling lights of London Bridge were past, and the tiers of shipping lay on either hand. It was not until now that the upper half of the man came back into the boat. His arms were wet and dirty, and he washed them over the side. In his right hand he held something, and he washed that in the river too. It was money. He chinked it once, and he blew upon it once, and he spat upon it once. "For luck," he hoarsely said before he put it in his pocket. "Lizzie?" The girl turned her face towards him with a start, and rowed in silence. Her face was very pale. He was a hook-nosed man, and with that and his bright eyes and his ruffled head bore a certain likeness to a roused bird of prey. "Take that thing off your face." She put it back. "Here, and give me hold of the sculls. I'll take the rest of the spell." "No, no, father, no. I can't indeed, father. I cannot sit so near it.' He was moving towards her to change places, but her terrified expostulation stopped him, and he resumed his seat.
'What hurt can it do you?'
'None, none. But I cannot bear it.'
'It's my belief you hate the sight of the very river.'
I do not like it, father.'
'As if it wasn't your living. As if it wasn't meat and drink to you.'
At these latter words the girl shivered again, and for a moment paused in her rowing, seeming to turn deadly faint. It escaped his attention, for he was glancing over the stern at something the boat had in tow.
'How can you be so thankless to your best friend, Lizzie? The very fire that warmed you when you were a babby was picked out of the river alongside of coal barges. The very basket that you slept in, the tide washed ashore. The very rockers that I put it upon to make a cradle of it, I cut out of a piece of wood that drifted from some ship or another.'
Lizzie took her right hand from the scull it held, and touched her lips with it, and for a moment held it out lovingly towards him. Then, without speaking, she resumed her rowing, as another boat of similar appearance, though in rather better trim, came out from a dark place, and dropped softly alongside.
'In luck again, Gaffer?'
said a man with a squinting leer, who sculled her and who was alone.
'I knowed you was in luck again, by your wake as you come down.' 'Ah,' replied the other dryly. 'So you're out, are you?' 'Yes, pardner.'
There was now a tender yellow moonlight on the river, and the newcomer, keeping half his boat's length astern of the other boat, looked hard at its track.
'I says to myself,' he went on, 'directly you hove in view, yonder's Gaffer, and in luck again, by George if he ain't. Scull it is, partner. Don't fret yourself. I didn't touch him.'
This was in answer to a quick impatient movement on the part of Gaffer, the speaker at the same time unshipping his scull on that side, and laying his hand on the gunwale of Gaffer's boat, and holding to it.
'He's had touches enough not to want no more, as well as I make him out, Gaffer. Been a knocking about with a pretty many tides, ain't he, partner? Such is my out-of-luck ways, you see. He must have passed me when he went up last time, for I was on the lookout below bridge here. I almost think you're like the Walters, partner, and sent him out.'
He spoke in a dropped voice, and with more than one glance at Lizzie, who had pulled on her hood again. Both men then looked with a weird unholy interest in the wake of Gaffer's boat.
'Easy does it betwixt us. Shall I take him aboard, partner?' 'No,' said the other, in so surly a tone that the man, after a blank stare, acknowledged it with the retort, 'Aren't been eating nothing as is disagreed with you, have you, partner?' 'Why, yes, I have,' said Gaffer. 'I have been swallowing too much of that word pardner. I'm no pardner of yours.' 'Since when was you no pardner of mine, Gaffer Hexam, Esquire?' 'Since you was accused of robbing a man. Accused of robbing a live man,' said Gaffer, with great indignation. 'And what if I had been accused of robbing a dead man, Gaffer?' 'You couldn't do it. Couldn't you, Gaffer?' 'No. Has a dead man any use for money? Is it possible for a dead man to have money? What world does a dead man belong to? T'other world. What world does money belong to? This world. How can money be a corpse's? Can a corpse own it? Want it? Spend it? Claim it? Miss it? Don't try to go confounding the rights and wrongs of things in that way, but it's worthy of the sneaking spirit that robs a live man. I'll tell you what it is. No, you won't. I'll tell you what it is. You got off with a short time of it of putting your hand in the pocket of a sailor, a live sailor. Make the most of it, and think yourself lucky, but don't think after that to come over me with your pardners. We have worked together in time past, but we work together no more in time present, nor yet future. Let go. Cast off. Gaffer, if you think to get rid of me this way— If I don't get rid of you this way, I'll try another, and chop you over the fingers with the stretcher, or take a pick at your head with the boat hook. Cast off. Pull you, Lizzie. Pull home, since you won't let your father pull.
Lizzie shot ahead, and the other boat fell astern. Lizzie's father, composing himself into the easy attitude of one who had asserted the high moralities and taken an unassailable position, slowly lighted a pipe, and smoked, and took a survey of what he had in tow. What he had in tow lunged itself at him sometimes in an awful manner when the boat was checked, and sometimes seemed to try to wrench itself away, though for the most part it followed submissively. A neophyte might have fancied that the ripples passing over it were dreadfully like faint changes of expression on a sightless face, but Gaffer was no neophyte, and had no fancies. End of Book 1, Chapter 1. Our Mutual Friend, by Charles Dickens. Book 1, The Cup and the Lip. Chapter 2, The Man from Somewhere. Mr. and Mrs. Veneering were brand new people in a brand new house in a brand new quarter of London. Everything about the Veneerings was spick and span new. All their furniture was new, all their friends were new, all their servants were new. Their plate was new, their carriage was new, their harness was new, their horses were new, their pictures were new, they themselves were new. They were as newly married as was lawfully compatible with their having a brand new baby, and if they had set up a great-grandfather, he would have come home in matting from the Pantechnicon without a scratch upon him, French polished to the crown of his head. For in the Veneering establishment, from the hall chairs with the new coat of arms, to the grand pianoforte with the new action, and upstairs again to the new fire escape, all things were in a state of high varnish and polish. And what was observable in the furniture was observable in the Veneerings. The surface smelt a little too much of the workshop, and was a trifle sticky. There was an innocent piece of dinner furniture that went upon easy casters, and was kept over a livery stable yard in Duke Street, St. James's, when not in use, to whom the Veneerings were a source of blind confusion. The name of this article was Twemlow. Being first cousin to Lord Snigsworth, he was in frequent requisition, and at many houses might be said to represent the dining table in its normal state. Mr. and Mrs. Veneering, for example, arranging a dinner, habitually started with Twemlow, and then put leaves in him, or added guests to him. Sometimes the table consisted of Twemlow and half a dozen leaves, sometimes of Twemlow and a dozen leaves, sometimes Twemlow was pulled out to his utmost extent of 20 leaves. Mr. and Mrs. Veneering, on occasions of ceremony, faced each other in the centre of the board, and thus the parallel still held, for it always happened that the more Twemlow was pulled out, the further he found himself from the centre, and nearer to the sideboard at one end of the room, or the window curtains at the other. But it was not this which steeped the feeble soul of Twemlow in confusion. This he was used to, and could take soundings of. The abyss to which he could find no bottom, and from which started forth the engrossing and ever-swelling difficulty of his life, was the insoluble question whether he was Veneering's oldest friend or newest friend. To the excogitation of this problem, the harmless gentleman had devoted many anxious hours, both in his lodgings over the livery stable yard, and in the cold gloom favourable to meditation of St. James's Square. Thus, Twemlow had first known Veneering at his club, where Veneering then knew nobody but the man who made them known to one another, who seemed to be the most intimate friend he had in the world, and whom he had known 2 days. The bond of union between their souls, the nefarious conduct of the committee respecting the cookery of a fillet of veal, having been accidentally cemented at that date. Immediately upon this, Twemlow received an invitation to dine with Veneering, and dined, the man being of the party. Immediately upon that, Twemlow received an invitation to dine with the man, and dined, Veneering being of the party. At the man's were a member, an engineer, a payer-off of the national debt, a poem on Shakespeare, a grievance, and a public office, who all seem to be utter strangers to Veneering. And yet immediately after that, Twemlow received an invitation to dine at Veneering's, expressly to meet the member, the engineer, the payer-off of the national debt, the poem on Shakespeare, the grievance, and the public office, and, dining, discovered that all of them were the most intimate friends Veneering had in the world, and that the wives of all of them, who were all there, were the objects of Mrs. Veneering's most devoted affection and tender confidence. Thus it had come about that Mr. Twemlow had said to himself in his lodgings, with his hand to his forehead, "I must not think of this. This is enough to soften any man's brain," and yet was always thinking of it, and could never form a conclusion. This evening the Veneerings give a banquet. 11 leaves in the Twemlow, 14 in company all told. 4 pigeon-breasted retainers in plain clothes stand in line in the hall, A fifth retainer, proceeding up the staircase with a mournful air, as who should say, "Here is another wretched creature come to dinner, such is life," announces Mr Twemlow. Mrs Veneering welcomes her sweet Mr Twemlow. Mr Veneering welcomes his dear Twemlow. Mrs Veneering does not expect that Mr Twemlow can in nature care much for such insipid things as babies, but so old a friend must please to look at baby. "Ah, you will know the friend of your family better, Tootletums," says Mr Veneering, nodding emotionally at that new article, "when you begin to take notice." He then begs to make his dear Twemlow known to his two friends, Mr Boots and Mr Brewer, and clearly has no distinct idea which is which. But now a fearful circumstance occurs. "Mr and Mrs Podsnap." "My dear," says Mr Veneering to Mrs Veneering with an air of much friendly interest, while the door stands open, "the Podsnaps." A too smiling large man with a fatal freshness on him, appearing with his wife, instantly deserts his wife and darts at Twemlow with, "How do you do? So glad to know you. Charming house you have here. I hope we are not late. So glad of the opportunity, I am sure." When the first shock fell upon him, Twemlow twice skipped back in his neat little shoes and his neat little silk stockings of a bygone fashion, as if impelled to leap over a sofa behind him, but the large man closed with him and proved too strong. "Let me," says the large man, trying to attract the attention of his wife in the distance, "have the pleasure of presenting Mrs Podsnap to our host. She will be—" in his fatal freshness he seems to find perpetual verdure and eternal youth in the phrase, "she will be so glad of the opportunity, I'm sure." In the meantime, Mrs Podsnap, unable to originate a mistake on her own account, because Mrs Veneering is the only other lady there, does her best in the way of handsomely supporting her husband's by looking towards Mr Twemlow with a plaintive countenance, and remarking to Mrs Veneering in a feeling manner, firstly, that she fears he has been rather bilious of late, and secondly, that the baby is already very like him. It is questionable whether any man quite relishes being mistaken for any other man. But Mr Veneering, having this very evening set up the shirt-front of the young Antinous in new-worked cambric just come home, is not at all complimented by being supposed to be Twemlow, who is dry and weazen and some 30 years older. Mrs Veneering equally resents the imputation of being the wife of Twemlow. As to Twemlow, he is so sensible of being a much better bred man than Veneering, that he considers of the large man an offensive ass. In this complicated dilemma, Mr Veneering approaches the large man with extended hand, and smilingly assures that incorrigible personage that he is delighted to see him, who in his fatal freshness instantly replies, "Thank you. I am ashamed to say that I cannot at this moment recall where we met, but I am so glad of this opportunity, I am sure." Then, pouncing upon Twemlow, who holds back with all his feeble might, he is hailing him off to present him as Veneering to Mrs Podsnap, when the arrival of more guests unravels the mistake. Whereupon, having reshaken hands with Veneering as Veneering, he reshakes hands with Twemlow as Twemlow, and winds it all up to his perfect satisfaction by saying to the last named, "Ridiculous opportunity, but so glad of it, I am sure." Now, Twemlow having undergone this terrific experience, having likewise noted the fusion of Boots in Brewer and Brewer in Boots, and having further observed that of the remaining 7 guests 4 discreet characters enter with wandering eyes and wholly declined to commit themselves as to which is Veneering until Veneering has them in his grasp, Twemlow, having profited by these studies, finds his brain wholesomely hardening as he approaches the conclusion that he really is Veneering's oldest friend, when his brain softens again and all is lost, through his eyes encountering Veneering and the large man linked together as twin brothers in the back drawing-room near the conservatory door, and through his ears informing him in the tones of Mrs Veneering that the same large man is to be baby's godfather. "Dinner is on the table." Thus the melancholy retainer, as who should say, "Come down and be poisoned, ye unhappy children of men." Twemlow, having no lady assigned him, goes down in the rear, with his hand to his forehead. Boots and Brewer, thinking him indisposed, whisper, "Man faint. Had no lunch." But he is only stunned by the unvanquishable difficulty of his existence. Revived by soup, Twemlow discourses mildly of the Court Circular with Boots and Brewer. Is appealed to at the fish stage of the banquet by Veneering on the disputed question whether his cousin Lord Snigsworth is in or out of town. Gives it that his cousin is out of town. "At Snigsworthy Park?" Veneering inquires. At Snigsworthy," Twemlow rejoins. Boots and Brewer regard this as a man to be cultivated, and Veneering is clear that he is a remunerative article. Meantime the retainer goes round like a gloomy analytical chemist, always seeming to say after, "Chablis, sir?" You wouldn't if you knew what it's made of. The great looking-glass above the sideboard reflects the table and the company, reflects the new Veneering crest, in gold and eke in silver, frosted and also thawed, a camel of all work. The Herald's College found out a crusading ancestor for Veneering who bore a camel on his shield, or might have done if he had thought of it, and a caravan of camels take charge of the fruits and flowers and candles, and kneel down to be loaded with the salt. Reflects Veneering, 40, wavy-haired, dark, tending to corpulence, sly, mysterious, filmy, a kind of sufficiently well-looking veiled prophet not prophesying. Reflects Mrs. Veneering, fair, aquiline nose and fingered, not so much light hair as she might have, gorgeous in raiment and jewels, enthusiastic, propitiatory, conscious that a corner of her husband's veil is over herself. Reflects Podsnap, prosperously feeding, two little light-coloured, wiry wings, one on either side of his else bald head, looking as like his hairbrushes as his hair, dissolving view of red beads on his forehead, large allowance of crumpled shirt-collar up behind. Reflects Mrs. Podsnap, fine woman for Professor Owen, quantity of bone, neck and nostrils like a rocking horse, hard features, majestic headdress in which Podsnap has hung golden offerings. Reflects Twemlow, grey, dry, polite, susceptible to east wind, first gentleman in Europe, collar and cravat, cheeks drawn in as if he had made a great effort to retire into himself some years ago, and had got so far, and had never got any farther. Reflects mature young lady, raven locks, and complexion that lights up well when well powdered, as it is, carrying on considerably in the captivation of mature young gentlemen, with too much nose in his face, too much ginger in his whiskers, too much torso in his waistcoat, too much sparkle in his studs, his eyes, his buttons, his talk, and his teeth. Reflects charming old Lady Tippins on Veneering's right, with an immense, obtuse, drab, oblong face, like a face in a tablespoon, and a dyed, long walk up on the top of her head, as a convenient public approach to the bunch of false hair behind. Pleased to patronize Mrs. Veneering opposite, who is pleased to be patronized. Reflects a certain Mortimer, another of Veneering's oldest friends, who never was in the house before, and appears not to want to come again, who sits disconsolate on Mrs. Veneering's left, and who is inveigled by Lady Tippins, a friend of his boyhood, to come to these peoples and talk, and who won't talk. Reflects Eugene, friend of Mortimer, buried alive in the back of his chair behind a shoulder, with a powder epaulet on it, of the mature young lady, and gloomily resorting to the champagne chalice whenever proffered by the analytical chemist. Lastly, the looking-glass reflects Boots and Brewer, and two other stuffed buffers interposed between the rest of the company and possible accidents. The Veneering dinners are excellent dinners, or new people wouldn't come, and all goes well. Notably, Lady Tippins has made a series of experiments on her digestive functions, so extremely complicated and daring that if they could be published with their results it might benefit the human race. Having taken in provisions from all parts of the world, this hardy old cruiser has last touched at the North Pole, when, as the ice plates are being removed, the following words fall from her. "I assure you, my dear Veneering." Poor Twemlow's hand approaches his forehead, for it would seem now that Lady Tippins is going to be the oldest friend. "I assure you, my dear Veneering, that it is the honest affair. Like the advertising people, I don't ask you to trust me without offering a respectable reference. Mortimer there is my reference and knows all about it." Mortimer raises his drooping eyelids and slightly opens his mouth, but a faint smile expressive of "what's the use" passes over his face, and he drops his eyelids and shuts his mouth. "Now, Mortimer," says Lady Tippins, rapping the sticks of a closed green fan upon the knuckles of her left hand, which is particularly rich in knuckles, "I insist upon your telling all that is to be told about the man from Jamaica." "Give you my honour, I never heard of any man from Jamaica, except the man who was a brother," replies Mortimer. "Tobago, then?" "Nor yet from Tobago." "Except—" Eugene strikes in so unexpectedly, the mature young lady, who has forgotten all about him, with a start takes the epaulet out of his way. "Except our friend, who long lived on rice pudding and isinglass, till at length, to his something or other, his physician said something else, and a leg of mutton somehow ended in Dago." A reviving impression goes round the table that Eugene is coming out. an unfulfilled impression, for he goes in again. "Now, my dear Mrs. Veneering," quoth Lady Tippins, "I appeal to you whether this is not the basest conduct ever known in this world. I carry my lovers about, 2 or 3 at a time, on condition that they are very obedient and devoted. And here is my oldest lover-in-chief, the head of all my slaves, throwing off his allegiance before company. And here is another of my lovers, a rough Simon at present certainly, but of whom I had most hopeful expectations as to his turning out well in course of time, pretending that he can't remember his nursery rhymes, on purpose to annoy me, for he knows how I dote upon them." A grisly little fiction concerning her lovers is Lady Tippins's point. She is always attended by a lover or two, and she keeps a little list of her lovers, and she is always booking a new lover, or striking out an old lover, or putting a lover in her black list, or promoting a lover to her blue list, or adding up her lovers, or otherwise posting her book. Mrs. Veneering is charmed by the humour, and so is Veneering. Perhaps it is enhanced by a certain yellow play in Lady Tippins's throat, like the legs of scratching poultry. "I banish the false wretch from this moment, and I strike him out of my Cupidon, my name for my ledger, my dear, this very night. But I am resolved to have the account of the man from somewhere, and I beg you to elicit it for me, my love," to Mrs. Veneering, "as I have lost my own influence. Oh, you perjured man!" This to Mortimer with a rattle of her fan. "We are all very much interested in the man from somewhere," Veneering observes. Then the 4 Buffers, taking heart of grace all 4 at once, say, "Deeply interested, quite excited, dramatic, man from nowhere perhaps." And then Mrs. Veneering, for the Lady Tippins's winning wiles are contagious, folds her hands in the manner of a supplicating child, turns to her left neighbour and says, "Cheese, pay, man from somewhere." At which the 4 Buffers, again mysteriously moved all 4 at once, explain, "You can't resist." "Upon my life," says Mortimer languidly, "I find it immensely embarrassing to have the eyes of Europe upon me to this extent, and my only consolation is that you will all of you execrate Lady Tippins in your secret hearts, when you find, as you inevitably will, the man from somewhere a bore. Sorry to destroy romance by fixing him with a local habitation, but he comes from the place, the name of which escapes me, but will suggest itself to everybody else here, where they make the wine." Eugene suggests, "Day and Martin's?" "No, not that place," returns the unmoved Mortimer. "That's where they make the port. My man comes from the country, where they make the Cape wine. But look here, old fellow, it's not at all statistical, and it's rather odd." It is always noticeable at the table of the Veneerings that no man troubles himself much about the Veneerings themselves, and that any one who has anything to tell generally tells it to anybody else in preference. "The man," Mortimer goes on, addressing Eugene, "whose name is Harmon, was only son of a tremendous old rascal who made his money by dust." "Red velveteens and a bell?" the gloomy Eugene inquires. "And a ladder and basket, if you like. By which means, or by others, he grew rich as a dust contractor, and lived in a hollow in a hilly country entirely composed of dust. On his own small estate, the growling old vagabond threw up his own mountain range like an old volcano, and its geological formation was dust. Coal dust, vegetable dust, bone dust, crockery dust, rough dust, and sifted dust, all manner of dust." A passing remembrance of Mrs. Veneering here induces Mortimer to address his next half-dozen words to her, after which he wanders away again, tries tremolo, and finds he doesn't answer, ultimately takes up with the Buffers, who receive him enthusiastically. The moral being, I believe that's the right expression, of this exemplary person, derived its highest gratification from anathematizing his nearest relations and turning them out of doors, having begun, as was natural, by rendering these attentions to the wife of his bosom. He next found himself at leisure to bestow a similar recognition on the claims of his daughter. He chose a husband for her entirely to his own satisfaction and not in the least to hers, and proceeded to settle upon her as her marriage portion, I don't know how much, dust, but something immense. At this stage of the affair the poor girl respectfully intimated that she was secretly engaged to that popular character whom the novelists and versifiers call another, and that such a marriage would make dust of her heart and dust of her life. In short, would set her up on a very extensive scale in her father's business. Immediately the venerable parent, on a cold winter's night, it is said, anathematized and turned her out. Here the analytical chemist, who has evidently formed a very low opinion of Mortimer's story, concedes a little claret to the Buffers, who, again mysteriously moved all four at once, screw it slowly into themselves with a peculiar twist of enjoyment, as they cry in chorus, "Pray go on." The pecuniary resources of another were, as they usually are, of a very limited nature. I believe I am not using too strong an expression when I say that another was hard up. However, he married the young lady, and they lived in a humble dwelling, probably possessing a porch ornamented with honeysuckle and woodbine twining, until she died. I must refer you to the registrar of the district in which the humble dwelling was situated for the certified cause of death, but early sorrow and anxiety may have had to do with it, though they may not appear in the ruled pages and printed forms. Indisputably, this was the case with another, for he was so cut up by the loss of his young wife that if he outlived her a year, it was as much as he did. There is that in the indolent Mortimer which seems to hint that if good society might on any account allow itself to be impressible, he, one of good society, might have the weakness to be impressed by what he here relates. It is hidden with great pains, but it is in him. The gloomy Eugene, too, is not without some kindred touch, for when that appalling Lady Tippins declares that if another had survived he should have gone down at the head of her list of lovers, and also when the mature young lady shrugs her epaulets and laughs at some private and confidential comment from the mature young gentleman, his gloom deepens to that degree that he trifles quite ferociously with his dessert-knife. Mortimer proceeds. We must now return, as novelists say, and as we all wish they wouldn't, to the man from somewhere. Being a boy of 14, cheaply educated at Brussels when his sister's expulsion befell, it was some little time before he heard of it, probably from herself, for the mother was dead, but that I don't know. Instantly he absconded and came over here. He must have been a boy of spirit and resource to get here on a stopped allowance of 5 sous a week, but he did it somehow, and he burst in on his father and pleaded his sister's cause. Venerable parent promptly resorts to anathematization and turns him out. Shocked and terrified boy takes flight, seeks his fortune, gets aboard ship, ultimately turns up on dry land among the Cape wine, small proprietor, farmer, grower, whatever you like to call it. At this juncture, shuffling is heard in the hall, and tapping is heard at the dining-room door. Analytical chemist goes to the door, confers angrily with unseen tapper, appears to become mollified by descrying reason in the tapping, and goes out. So he was discovered, only the other day, after having been expatriated about 14 years. A Buffer, suddenly astounding the other three by detaching himself and asserting individuality, inquires, "How discovered, and why?" "Ah, to be sure. Thank you for reminding me. Venerable parent dies." Same Buffer, emboldened by success, says, "When?" "The other day, 10 or 12 months ago." Same Buffer inquires with smartness, "What of?" But herein perishes a melancholy example, being regarded by the 3 other Buffers with a stony stare, and attracting no further attention from any mortal. "Venerable parent," Mortimer repeats, with a passing remembrance that there is a Veneering at table, and for the first time addressing him, "dies." The gratified Veneering repeats gravely, "dies," and folds his arms, and composes his brow to hear it out in a judicial manner, when he finds himself again deserted in the bleak world. "His will is found," said Mortimer, catching Mrs Podsnap's rocking horse's eye. "It is dated very soon after the sun's flight. It leaves the lowest of the range of dust mountains, with some sort of a dwelling-house at its foot, to an old servant, who is sole executor, and all the rest of the property, which is very considerable, to the son. He directs himself to be buried with certain eccentric ceremonies and precautions against his coming to life, with which I need not bore you, and that's all, except—" And this ends the story. The analytical chemist returning, everybody looks at him. Not because anybody wants to see him, but because of that subtle influence in nature which impels humanity to embrace the slightest opportunity of looking at anything rather than the person who addresses it. "Except that the son's inheriting is made conditional on his marrying a girl who at the date of the will was a child of 4 or 5 years old, and who is now a marriageable young woman. Advertisement and inquiry discovered the son and the man from somewhere, and at the present moment he is on his way home from there, no doubt in a state of great astonishment, to succeed to a very large fortune and to take a wife." Mrs Podsnap inquires whether the young person is a young person of personal charms. Mortimer is unable to report. Mr Podsnap inquires what would become of the very large fortune in the event of the marriage conditions not being fulfilled. Mortimer replies that by special testamentary clause it would then go to the old servant above mentioned, passing over and excluding the son. Also, that if the son had not been living, the same old servant would have been sole residuary legatee. Mrs Veneering has just succeeded in waking Lady Tippins from a snore by dexterously shunting a train of plates and dishes at her knuckles across the table, when everybody but Mortimer himself becomes aware that the analytical chemist is, in a ghostly manner, offering him a folded paper. Curiosity detains Mrs Veneering a few moments. Mortimer, in spite of all the arts of the chemist, placidly refreshes himself with a glass of Madeira, and remains unconscious of the document which engrosses the general attention, until Lady Tippins, who has a habit of waking totally insensible, having remembered where she is, and recovered a perception of surrounding objects, says, "Falser man than Don Juan, why don't you take the note from the commendatore?" Upon which the chemist advances it under the nose of Mortimer, who looks round at him and says, "What's this?" Analytical chemist bends and whispers. "Who?" says Mortimer. Analytical chemist again bends and whispers. Mortimer stares at him and unfolds the paper, reads it twice, turns it over to look at the blank outside, reads it a third time. "This arrives in an extraordinarily opportune manner," says Mortimer. Then, looking with an altered face round the table, "This is the conclusion of the story of the identical man." "Already married?" one guesses. "Declines to marry," another guesses. "Codicil among the dust," another guesses. "Why, no," says Mortimer. "Remarkable thing. You're all wrong. The story is completer and rather more exciting than I supposed. Man's drowned." End of Book 1, Chapter 2. Our Mutual Friend, by Charles Dickens. Book 1, The Cup and the Lip. Chapter 3, Another Man. As the disappearing skirts of the ladies ascended the Veneering staircase, Mortimer, following them forth from the dining-room, turned into a library of brand-new books, in brand-new bindings, liberally gilded, and requested to see the messenger who had brought the paper. He was a boy of about 15. Mortimer looked at the boy, and the boy looked at the brand-new pilgrims on the wall, going to Canterbury in more gold frame than procession, and more carving than country. "Whose writing is this?" "Mine, sir." "Who told you to write it?"
"My father, Jesse Hexam."
"Is it he who found the body?"
"Yes, sir."
"What is your father?" The boy hesitated, looking reproachfully at the pilgrims, as if they had involved him in a little difficulty, then said, folding a pleat in the right leg of his trousers, "He gets his living along shore." "Is it far?"
"Is which far?"
asked the boy, upon his guard, and again upon the road to Canterbury. "To your father's."
"It's a goodish stretch, sir. I come up in a cab, and the cab's waiting to be paid. We could go back in it before you paid it, if you liked. I went first to your office, according to the direction of the papers found in the pockets, and there I see nobody but a chap of about my age who sent me on here." There was a curious mixture in the boy of uncompleted savagery and uncompleted civilization. His voice was hoarse and coarse, and his face was coarse, and his stunted figure was coarse, but he was cleaner than other boys of his type, and his writing, though large and round, was good, and he glanced at the backs of the books with an awakened curiosity that went below the binding. No one who can read ever looks at a book, even unopened on a shelf, like one who cannot. "Were any means taken, do you know, boy, to ascertain if it was possible to restore life?" Mortimer inquired, as he sought for his hat. "You wouldn't ask, sir, if you knew his state. Pharaoh's multitude that were drowned in the Red Sea ain't more beyond restoring to life. If Lazarus was only half as far gone, that was the greatest of all the miracles." "Hallo!" cried Mortimer, turning round with his hat upon his head. "You seem to be at home in the Red Sea, my young friend." "Read of it with teacher at the school," said the boy. "And Lazarus?" "Yes, him too. But don't you tell my father. We should have no peace in our place if that got touched upon. It's my sister's contriving." "You seem to have a good sister." "She ain't half bad," said the boy. "But if she knows her letters, it's the most she does, and them I learned her." The gloomy Eugene, with his hands in his pockets, had strolled in and assisted at the latter part of the dialogue,
When the boy spoke these words slightingly of his sister, he took him roughly enough by the chin, and turned up his face to look at it.
"Well, I'm sure, sir," said the boy, resisting. "I hope you'll know me again."
Eugene vouchsafed no answer, but made the proposal to Mortimer. "I'll go with you, if you like." So they all three went away together in the vehicle that had brought the boy. The two friends, once boys together at a public school, inside, smoking cigars, the messenger on the box beside the driver. "Let me see," said Mortimer as they went along. "I have been, Eugene, upon the honourable roll of solicitors at the High Court of Chancery and attorneys at common law 5 years, and, except gratuitously taking instructions, on an average once a fortnight, for the will of Lady Tippins, who has nothing to leave, I have had no scrap of business but this romantic business." "And I," said Eugene, "have been called 7 years, and have had no business at all, and never shall have any, and if I had, I shouldn't know how to do it." "I am far from being clear as to the last particular," returned Mortimer with great composure, "that I have much advantage over you." "I hate," said Eugene, putting his legs up on the opposite seat, "I hate my profession." "Shall I incommode you if I put mine up too?" returned Mortimer. "Thank you. I hate mine." "It was forced upon me," said the gloomy Eugene, "because it was understood that we wanted a barrister in the family. We have got a precious one." "It was forced upon me," said Mortimer, "because it was understood that we wanted a solicitor in the family, and we have got a precious one." "There are 4 of us, with our names painted on a doorpost in right of one black hole called a set of chambers," said Eugene, "and each of us has the 4th of a clerk, Cassim Baba in the robber's cave, and Cassim is the only respectable member of the party." "I am one by myself, one," said Mortimer, "high up in an awful staircase commanding a burial ground, and I have a whole clerk to myself, and he has nothing to do but look at the burial ground, and what he will turn out when arrived at maturity I cannot conceive. Whether in that shabby rook's nest he is always plotting wisdom or plotting murder, whether he will grow up after so much solitary brooding to enlighten his fellow creatures or to poison them, is the only speck of interest that presents itself to my professional view. Will you give me a light? Thank you." "Then idiots talk," said Eugene, leaning back, folding his arms, smoking with his eyes shut, and speaking slightly through his nose, "of energy. If there is a word in the dictionary under any letter from A to Z that I abominate, it is energy. It is such a conventional superstition, such parrot gabble. What the deuce! Am I to rush out into the street, collar the first man of a wealthy appearance that I meet, shake him and say, 'Go to law upon the spot, you dog, and retain me, or I'll be the death of you'? Yet that would be energy." "Precisely my view of the case, Eugene. But show me a good opportunity, show me something really worth being energetic about, and I'll show you energy." "And so will I," said Eugene. And it is likely enough that 10,000 other young men within the limits of the London Post Office town delivery made the same hopeful remark in the course of the same evening. The wheels rolled on, and rolled down by the Monument, and by the Tower, and by the Docks, down by Ratcliffe, and by Rotherhithe, down by where accumulated scum of humanity seemed to be washed from higher grounds, like so much moral sewage, and to be pausing till its own weight forced it over the bank, and sunk it in the river. In and out among vessels that seemed to have got ashore, and houses that seemed to have got afloat, among bowsprits staring into windows, and windows staring into ships, the wheels rolled on until they stopped at a dark corner, river washed and otherwise not washed at all, where the boy alighted and opened the door.
"You must walk the rest, sir. It's not many yards."
He spoke in the singular number, to the express exclusion of Eugene. "This is a confoundedly out-of-the-way place," said Mortimer, slipping over the stones and refuse on the shore, as the boy turned the corner sharp.
"Here's my father's, sir, where the light is."
The low building had the look of having once been a mill. There was a rotten wart of wood upon its forehead, that seemed to indicate where the sails had been, but the whole was very indistinctly seen in the obscurity of the night. The boy lifted the latch of the door, and they passed at once into a low circular room, where a man stood before a red fire, looking down into it, and a girl sat engaged in needlework. The fire was in a rusty brazier, not fitted to the hearth, and a common lamp, shaped like a hyacinth root, smoked and flared in the neck of a stone bottle on the table. There was a wooden bunk or berth in a corner, and in another corner a wooden stair leading above, so clumsy and steep that it was little better than a ladder. 2 or 3 old sculls and oars stood against the wall, and against another part of the wall was a small dresser, making a spare show of the commonest articles of crockery and cooking vessels. The roof of the room was not plastered, but was formed of the flooring of the room above. This, being very old, knotted, seamed, and beamed, gave a lowering aspect to the chamber, and roof and walls and floor, alike abounding in all smears of flour, red lead, or some such stain which it had probably acquired in warehousing, and damp, alike had a look of decomposition. "The gentleman, father." The figure at the red fire turned, raised its ruffled head, and looked like a bird of prey. "You're Mortimer Lightwood, Esquire, are you, sir?" "Mortimer Lightwood is my name. What you found," said Mortimer, glancing rather shrinkingly towards the bunk, "is it here?" "'Tain't not to say here, but it's close by. I do everything reg'lar. I've given notice of the circumstance to the police, and the police have took possession of it. No, time ain't been lost on any hand. The police have put into print already, and here's what the print says of it." Taking up the bottle with the lamp in it, he held it near a paper on the wall, with the police heading, "Body Found." The 2 friends read the handbill as it stuck against the wall, and Gaffer read them as he held the light. "Only papers on the unfortunate man, I see," said Lightwood, glancing from the description of what was found to the finder. "Only papers." Here the girl arose with her work in her hand, and went out at the door. "No money," pursued Mortimer, "but threepence in one of the shirt pockets." 3 penny pieces," said Gaffer Hexam, in as many sentences. "The trouser pockets empty and turned inside out." Gaffer Hexam nodded. "But that's common. Whether it's the wash of the tide or no, I can't say. Now here," moving the light to another similar placard, "his pocket was found empty and turned inside out. And here," moving the light to another, "her pocket was found empty and turned inside out, and so was this one's, and so was that one's. I can't read, nor I don't want to it, for I know 'em by their places on the wall. This one was a sailor with 2 anchors and a flag and a GFT on his arm. Look and see if he warn't." "Quite right." "This one was a young woman in grey boots, and her linen marked with a cross. Look and see if she warn't." "Quite right." "This is him as had a nasty cut over the eye. This is them 2 young sisters what tied themselves together with a handkercher. This the drunken old chap, in a pair of list slippers and a nightcap, what had offered, it afterwards came out, to make a hole in the water for a quarter of rum, stood aforehand, and kept to his word for the first time and last time in his life. They pretty well papers the room, you see, but I know 'em all. I'm scholar enough." He waved the light over the whole, as if to typify the light of his scholarly intelligence, and then put it down on the table and stood behind it looking intently at his visitors. He had the special peculiarity of some birds of prey, that when he knitted his brow, his ruffled crest stood highest. "You did not find all these yourself, did you?" asked Eugene. To which the bird of prey slowly rejoined, "And what might your name be, now?" "This is my friend," Mortimer Lightwood interposed, "Mr. Eugene Wrayburn." "Mr. Eugene Wrayburn, is it? And what might Mr. Eugene Wrayburn have asked of me?" "I asked you simply if you found all these yourself." "I answer you simply. Most on 'em." "Do you suppose there's been much violence and robbery beforehand among these cases?" "I don't suppose at all about it," returned Gaffer. "I ain't one of the supposing sort. If you got your living to haul out of the river every day of your life, you mightn't be much given to supposing. Am I to show the way?" As he opened the door, in pursuance of a nod from Lightwood, an extremely pale and disturbed face appeared in the doorway, the face of a man much agitated. "A body missing?" asked Gaffer Hexam, stopping short. "Or a body found? Which?" I am lost," replied the man, in a hurried and an eager manner. "Lost?" I am a stranger, and I don't know the way. I want to find the place where I can see what is described here. It is possible I may know it." He was panting, and could hardly speak, but he showed a copy of the newly printed bill that was still wet upon the wall. Perhaps its newness, or perhaps the accuracy of his observation of its general look, guided Gaffer to a ready conclusion. 'This gentleman, Mr Lightwood, is on that business.' 'Mr Lightwood?' During a pause, Mortimer and the stranger confronted each other. Neither knew the other. 'I think, sir,' said Mortimer, breaking the awkward silence with his airy self-possession, 'that you did me the honour to mention my name?' 'I repeated it after this man.' 'You said you were a stranger in London?' 'An utter stranger.' 'Are you seeking a Mr Harmon?' 'No.' 'Then I believe I can assure you that you are on a fruitless errand, and will not find what you fear to find. Will you come with us?' A little winding through some muddy alleys that might have been deposited by the last ill-savoured tide, brought them to the wicket gate and bright lamp of a police station, where they found the night inspector with a pen and ink and ruler posting up his books in a whitewashed office, as studiously as if he were in a monastery on top of a mountain, and no howling fury of a drunken woman were banging herself against a cell door in the backyard at his elbow. With the same air of a recluse, much given to study, he desisted from his books to bestow a distrustful nod of recognition upon Gaffer, plainly importing, we know all about you, and you'll overdo it some day, and to inform Mr Mortimer Lightwood and friends that he would attend them immediately. Then he finished ruling the work he had in hand, it might have been illuminating a missal, he was so calm, in a very neat and methodical manner, showing not the slightest consciousness of the woman who was banging herself with increased violence and shrieking most terrifically for some other woman's liver. 'A bull's-eye,' said the night inspector, taking up his keys, which a differential satellite produced. 'Now, gentlemen.' With one of his keys he opened a cool grot at the end of the yard, and they all went in. They quickly came out again, no one speaking but Eugene, who remarked to Mortimer in a whisper, 'Not much worse than Lady Tippins.' So, back to the whitewashed library of the monastery, with that liver still in shrieking requisition, as it had been loudly while they looked at the silent sight they came to see, and there through the merits of the case as summed up by the abbot. No clue to how body came into river. Very often was no clue. Too late to know for certain whether injury is received before or after death. One excellent surgical opinion said before, other excellent surgical opinion said after. Steward of ship in which gentleman came home passenger had been round to view, and could swear to identity. Likewise could swear to clothes. And then, you see, you had the papers too. How was it he had totally disappeared on leaving ship, till found in river? Well, probably had been upon some little game. Probably thought it a harmless game. Wasn't up to things, and it turned out a fatal game. Inquest tomorrow, and no doubt open verdict. 'It appears to have knocked your friend over. Knocked him completely off his legs,' Mr Inspector remarked when he had finished his summing up. 'It has given him a bad turn, to be sure.' This was said in a very low voice, and with a searching look, not the first he had cast at the stranger. Mr Lightwood explained that it was no friend of his. 'Indeed?' said Mr Inspector with an attentive ear. 'Where did you pick him up?' Mr Lightwood explained further. Mr Inspector had delivered his summing up, and had added these words, with his elbows leaning on his desk, and the fingers and thumb of his right hand fitting themselves to the fingers and thumb of his left. Mr Inspector moved nothing but his eyes, as he now added, raising his voice, 'Turned you faint, sir? Seems you're not accustomed to this kind of work.' The stranger, who was leaning against the chimney-piece, with drooping head, looked round and answered, 'No. It's a horrible sight.' 'You expected to identify, I'm told, sir?' 'Yes.' 'Have you identified?' 'No. It's a horrible sight. Oh, a horrible, horrible sight.' 'Who did you think it might have been?' asked Mr Inspector. 'Give us a description, sir. Perhaps we can help you.' 'No, no,' said the stranger. 'It would be quite useless. Good night.' Mr Inspector had not moved, and had given no order, but the satellite slipped his back against the wicket, and laid his left arm along the top of it, and with his right hand turned the bull's-eye he had taken from his chief, in quite a casual manner, towards the stranger. 'You missed a friend, you know, or you missed a foe, you know, or you wouldn't have come here, you know. Well then, ain't it reasonable to ask, who was it?' Thus Mr Inspector. 'You must excuse my telling you. No class of man can understand better than you that families may not choose to publish their disagreements and misfortunes except on the last necessity. I do not dispute that you discharge your duty in asking me the question. You will not dispute my right to withhold the answer. Good night.' Again he turned towards the wicket, where the satellite, with his eye upon his chief, remained a dumb statue. 'At least,' said Mr Inspector, 'you will not object to leave me your card, sir?' 'I should not object, if I had one, but I have not.' He reddened and was much confused as he gave the answer. 'At least,' said Mr Inspector, with no change of voice or manner, 'you will not object to write down your name and address?' 'Not at all.' Mr Inspector dipped a pen in his inkstand and deftly laid it on a piece of paper close beside him, then resumed his former attitude. The stranger stepped up to the desk and wrote in a rather tremulous hand, Mr Inspector taking sidelong note of every hair of his head when it was bent down for the purpose: Mr Julius Handford, Exchequer Coffee House, Palace Yard, Westminster. 'Staying there, I presume, sir?' 'Staying there.' 'Consequently, from the country?' 'Eh? Yes, from the country.' 'Good night, sir.' The satellite removed his arm and opened the wicket, and Mr Julius Handford went out. 'Reserve,' said Mr Inspector. 'Take care of this piece of paper. Keep him in view without giving offence. Ascertain that he is staying there, and find out anything you can about him.' The satellite was gone, and Mr Inspector, becoming once again the quiet abbot of that monastery, dipped his pen in his ink and resumed his books. The two friends who had watched him, more amused by the professional manner than suspicious of Mr Julius Handford, inquired before taking their departure too whether he believed there was anything that really looked bad here. The abbot replied with reticence, couldn't say. If a murder, anybody might have done it. Burglary or pocket-picking wanted prenticeship. Not so murder. We were all of us up to that. Had seen scores of people come to identify, and never saw one person struck in that particular way. Might, however, have been stomach and not mind. If so, rum stomach. But to be sure, there were rum everythings. Pity there was not a word of truth in that superstition about bodies bleeding when touched by the hand of the right person. You never got a sign out of bodies. You got row enough out of such as her. She was good for all night now, referring here to the banging demands for the liver. But you got nothing out of bodies, if it was ever so. There being nothing more to be done until the inquest was held next day, the friends went away together, and Gaffer Hexam and his son went their separate way. But, arriving at the last corner, Gaffer bade his boy go home, while he turned into a red-curtained tavern that stood dropsically bulging over the causeway for a half a pint. The boy lifted the latch he had lifted before, and found his sister again seated before the fire at her work, who raised her head upon his coming in, and asked,
"Where did you go, Liz?"
"I went out in the dark."
"There was no necessity for that. It was all right enough."
"One of the gentlemen, the one who didn't speak while I was there, looked hard at me, and I was afraid he might know what my face meant. But there, don't mind me, Charley. I was all in a tremble of another sort when you owned to father you could write a little."
"Ah, but I may believe I wrote so badly as that it was odds if any one could read it. And when I wrote slowest and smeared but with my finger most, father was best pleased as he stood looking over me."
The girl put aside her work, and drawing her seat close to his seat by the fire, laid her arm gently on his shoulder.
"You'll make the most of your time, Charley, won't you?"
"Won't I? Come, I like that. Don't I?"
"Yes, Charley, yes. You work hard at your learning, I know, and I work a little, Charley, and plan and contrive a little, wake out of my sleep contriving sometimes, how to get together a shilling now, and a shilling then, that shall make father believe you're beginning to earn a stray living along shore."
"You're father's favourite, and can make him believe anything."
"I wish I could, Charley, for if I could make him believe that learning was a good thing, and that we might lead better lives, I should be almost content to die."
"Don't talk stuff about dying, Liz."
She placed her hands in one another on his shoulder, and laying her rich brown cheek against them as she looked down at the fire, went on thoughtfully.
"Of an evening, Charley, when you were at the school, and father's—"
"At the Six Jolly Fellowship Porters,"
The boy struck in with a backward nod of his head towards the public house.
Yes. Then as I sit a-looking at the fire, I seem to see in the burning coal, like where that glow is now. That's gas, that is, said the boy, coming out of a bit of a forest as been under the mud that was under the water in the days of Noah's Ark. Look here, when I take the poker so and give it a dig— Don't disturb it, Charley, or it'll be all in a blaze. It's that dull glow near it, coming and going, that I mean. When I look at it of an evening, it comes like pictures to me, Charley. Show us a picture, said the boy. Tell us where to look. Ah, it wants my eyes, Charley. Cut away, then, and tell us what your eyes make of it. Why, there are you and me, Charley, when you were quite a baby that never knew a mother. Don't go saying I never knew a mother, interposed the boy, for I knew a little sister that was sister and mother both.
The girl laughed delightedly, and here eyes filled with pleasant tears, as he put both his arms around her waist, and so held her.
There are you and me, Charley, when father was away at work and locked us out for fear we should set ourselves afire or fall out of window, sitting on the door-sill, sitting on the other doorsteps, sitting on the bank of the river, wandering about to get through the time. You are rather heavy to carry, Charley, and I am often obliged to rest. Sometimes we are sleepy and fall asleep together in a corner. Sometimes you are very hungry. Sometimes you are a little frightened. But what is oftenest hard upon us is the cold. You remember, Charley? I remember, said the boy, pressing her to him twice or thrice, that I snuggled under a little shawl, and it was warm there. Sometimes it rains, and we creep under a boat or the like of that. Sometimes it's dark, and we get among the gaslights, sitting watching the people as they go along the streets. At last up comes father and takes us home. And home seems such a shelter after out of doors, and father pulls my shoes off and dries me feet at the fire and has me to sit by him while he smokes his pipe long after you are abed. And I notice that father's is a large hand, but never a heavy one when it touches me, and that father's is a rough voice, but never an angry one when it speaks to me. So I grow up, and little by little father trusts me and makes me his companion, and, let him be put out as he may, never once strikes me.
The listening boy gave a grunt here, as much as to say, but he strikes me, though.
Those are some of the pictures of what is past, Charley. Cut away again, said the boy, and give us a fortune-telling one, a future one. Well, there am I, continuing with father and holding to father, because father loves me, and I love father. I can't so much as read a book, because if I had learnt, father would have thought I was deserting him, and I should have lost my influence. I have not the influence I want to have. I cannot stop some dreadful things I try to stop, but I go on in the hope and trust that the time will come. In the meanwhile, I know that I am in some things a stay to father, and if I was not faithful to him, he would, in revenge like, or in disappointment, or both, go wild and bad. Give us a touch of the fortune-telling pictures about me. I was passing on to them, Charley, said the girl, who had not changed her attitude since she began, and who now mournfully shook her head. The others were all leading up. There are you. Where am I, Liz? Still down in the hollow, down by the flare. There seems to be the deuce and all in the hollow down by the flare, said the boy, glancing from her eyes to the brazier, which had a grisly skeleton look on its long thin legs. There are you, Charley, working your way, in secret from father, at the school, and you get prizes, and you go on better and better, and you come to be a— what was it you called it when you told me about that? Ha ha! Fortune-telling not know the name, cried the boy, seeming to be rather relieved by this default on the part of the hollow down by the flare. Pupil teacher. You come to be a pupil teacher, and you still go on better and better, and you rise to be a master full of learning and respect. But the secret has come to father's knowledge long before, and it has divided you from father and from me. No, it hasn't. Yes, it has, Charley. I see as plain can be that your way is not ours, and that even if father could be got to forgive your taking it, which he never could be. That way of yours would be darkened by our way. But I see too, Charley. Still as plain can be, Liz?' asked the boy playfully. 'Ah, still, that it is a great work to have cut you away from father's life, and to have made a new and good beginning. So there am I, Charley, left alone with father, keeping him as straight as I can, watching for more influence than I have, and hoping that through some fortunate chance, or when he is ill, or when I don't know what, I may turn him to wish to do better things. You said you couldn't read a book, Lizzie. Your library of books is the hollow down by the flare, I think.' 'I should be very glad to be able to read real books. I feel my want of learning very much, Charley, but I should feel it much more if I didn't know it to be a tie between me and father. Hark! Father's tread!' It being now past midnight, the bird of prey went straight to roost. At midday following, he reappeared at the Six Jolly Fellowship Porters in the character, not new to him, of a witness before a coroner's jury. Mr Mortimer Lightwood, besides sustaining the character of one of the witnesses, doubled the part of that of the eminent solicitor who watched the proceedings on behalf of the representatives of the deceased, as was duly recorded in the newspapers. Mr Inspector watched the proceedings too, and kept his watching closely to himself. Mr Julius Handford, having given his right address, and being reported in solvent circumstances as to his bill, though nothing more was known of him at his hotel, except that his way of life was very retired, had no summons to appear, and was merely present in the shades of Mr Inspector's mind. The case was made interesting to the public by Mr Mortimer Lightwood's evidence touching the circumstances under which the deceased Mr John Harmon had returned to England, exclusive private proprietorship in which circumstances were set up at dinner tables for several days by Veneering, Twemlow, Podsnap, and all the Buffers, who all related them irreconcilably with one another, and contradicted themselves. It was also made interesting by the testimony of Job Potterson, the ship's steward, and one Mr Jacob Kibble, a fellow passenger, that the deceased Mr John Harmon did bring over, in a hand valise with which he did disembark, the sum realized by the forced sale of his little landed property, and that the sum exceeded, in ready money, £700. It was further made interesting by the remarkable experiences of Jessie Hexam in having rescued from the Thames so many dead bodies, and for whose behoof a rapturous admirer, subscribing himself a friend to burial, perhaps an undertaker, sent 18 postage stamps and 5 "Now, sirs" to the editor of the Times. Upon the evidence adduced before them, the jury found that the body of Mr John Harmon had been discovered floating in the Thames, in an advanced state of decay and much injured, and that the said Mr John Harmon had come by his death under highly suspicious circumstances, though by whose act or in what precise manner there was no evidence before this jury to show. And they appended to their verdict a recommendation to the Home Office, which Mr Inspector appeared to think highly sensible, to offer a reward for the solution of the mystery. Within 48 hours, a reward of £100 was proclaimed, together with a free pardon to any person or persons not the actual perpetrator or perpetrators, and so forth in due form. This proclamation rendered Mr Inspector additionally studious, and caused him to stand meditating on river stairs and causeways, and to go lurking about in boats, putting this and that together. But, according to the success with which you put this and that together, you get a woman and a fish apart, or a mermaid in combination. And Mr Inspector could turn out nothing better than a mermaid, which no judge and jury would believe in. Thus, like the tides on which it had been borne to the knowledge of men, the Harmon murder, as it came to be popularly called, went up and down, and ebbed and flowed, now in the town, now in the country, now among palaces, now among hovels, now among lords and ladies and gentlefolks, now among labourers and hammerers and ballast heavers, until at last, after a long interval of slack water, it got out to sea and drifted away. End of Book 1, Chapter 3. Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. Book 1, The Cup and the Lip. Chapter 4, The R. Wilfer Family. Reginald Wilfer is a name with rather a grand sound, suggesting on first acquaintance brasses in country churches, scrolls in stained glass windows, and generally the De Wilfers who came over with the Conqueror. For it is a remarkable fact in genealogy that no De Anyones ever came over with anybody else. But the Reginald Wilfer family
were of such commonplace extraction and pursuits that their forefathers had for generations modestly subsisted on the docks, the excise office, and the custom house, and the existing R. Wilfer was a poor clerk. So poor a clerk, though having a limited salary and an unlimited family, that he had never yet attained the modest object of his ambition, which was to wear a complete new suit of clothes, hat and boots included, at one time. His black hat was brown before he could afford a coat. His pantaloons were white at the seams and knees before he could buy a pair of boots. His boots had worn out before he could treat himself to new pantaloons, and by the time he worked round to the hat again, that shining modern article roofed in an ancient ruin of various periods. If the conventional cherub could ever grow up and be clothed, he might be photographed as a portrait of Wilfer. His chubby, smooth, innocent appearance was a reason for his being always treated with condescension when he was not put down. A stranger entering his own poor house at about 10 o'clock p.m. might have been surprised to find him sitting up to supper. So boyish was he in his curves and proportions that his old schoolmaster, meeting him in Cheapside, might have been unable to withstand the temptation of caning him on the spot. In short, he was the conventional cherub, after the supposititious shoot just mentioned, rather grey, with signs of care on his expression, and in decidedly insolvent circumstances. He was shy and unwilling to own to the name of Reginald, as being too aspiring and self-assertive a name. In his signature he used only the initial R, and imparted what it really stood for to none but chosen friends under the seal of confidence. Out of this the facetious habit had arisen in the neighbourhood surrounding Mincing Lane of making Christian names for him of adjectives and participles, beginning with R. Some of these were more or less appropriate, as rusty, retiring, ruddy, round, ripe, ridiculous, ruminative. Others derived their point from their want of application, as raging, rattling, roaring, raffish. But his popular name was Rumpty, which in a moment of inspiration had been bestowed upon him by a gentleman of convivial habits connected with the drug markets, as the beginning of a social chorus, his leading part in the execution of which had led this gentleman to the Temple of Fame, and of which the whole expressive burden ran: Rumpty iddity row dow dow, sing toodly teedly bow wow wow. Thus he was constantly addressed, even in minor notes on business, as Dear Rumpty, in answer to which he sedately signed himself Yours truly, R. Wilfer. He was clerk in the drug house of Chicksey, Veneering and Stobbles. Chicksey and Stobbles, his former masters, had both become absorbed in Veneering, once their traveller or commission agent, who had signalized his accession to supreme power by bringing into the business a quantity of plate glass window and French polished mahogany partition, and a gleaming and enormous doorplate. R. Wilfer locked up his desk one evening, and putting his bunch of keys in his pocket, much as if it were his peg-top, made for home. His home was in the Holloway region north of London, and then divided from it by fields and trees. Between Battle Bridge and that part of the Holloway district in which he dwelt was a tract of suburban Sahara, where tiles and bricks were burnt, bones were boiled, carpets were beat, rubbish was shot, dogs were fought, and dust was heaped by contractors. Skirting the border of this desert by the way he took, when the light of its kiln fires made lurid smears on the fog, R. Wilfer sighed and shook his head. Ah me, said he, what might have been is not what is. With which commentary on human life, indicating an experience of it not exclusively his own, he made the best of his way to the end of his journey. Mrs. Wilfer was, of course, a tall woman, and an angular. Her lord being cherubic, she was necessarily majestic, according to the principle which matrimonially unites contrasts. She was much given to tying up her head in a pocket handkerchief, knotted under the chin. This headgear, in conjunction with a pair of gloves worn within doors, she seemed to consider as at once a kind of armour against misfortune, invariably assuming it when in low spirits or difficulties, and as a species of full dress. It was therefore with some sinking of the spirit that her husband beheld her thus heroically attired, putting down her candle in the little hall, and coming down the doorsteps to the little front court to open the gate for him. Something had gone wrong with the house door, for R. Wilfer stopped on the steps, staring at it, and cried, "Hullo!" "Yes," said Mrs. Wilfer, "the man came himself with a pair of pincers, and took it off, and took it away. He said that as he had no expectation of ever being paid for it, and as he had an order for another ladies' school door-plate, it was better, burnished up, for the interests of all parties." "Perhaps it was, my dear. What do you think?"
You are master here, R.W., returned his wife. It is as you think, not as I do. Perhaps it might have been better if the man had taken the door too.
My dear, we couldn't have done without the door.
Couldn't we?
Why, my dear, could we?
It is as you think, R.W., not as I do.
With those submissive words, the dutiful wife preceded him down a few stairs to a little basement front room, half kitchen, half parlour, where a girl of about 19, with an exceedingly pretty figure and face, but with an impatient and petulant expression both in her face and in her shoulders, which in her sex at her age are very expressive of discontent, sat playing draughts with a younger girl, who was the youngest of the house of Wilfer. Not to encumber this page by telling off the Wilfers in detail and casting them up in the gross, it is enough for the present that the rest were what is called out in the world, in various ways, and that they were many. So many that when one of his dutiful children called in to see him, R. Wilfer generally seemed to say to himself, after a little mental arithmetic, "Oh, here's another of 'em," before adding aloud, "Howdy-do, John," or Susan, as the case might be. "Well, Piggy-wiggies," said R.W., "howdy-do to-night? What I was thinking of, my dear," to Mrs Wilfer, already seated in a corner with folded gloves, "was that as we have let our first floor so well, and as we have now no place in which you could teach pupils, even if pupils—"
"The milkman said he knew of 2 young ladies of the highest respectability who were in search of a suitable establishment, and he took a card," interposed Mrs Wilfer, with severe monotony, as if she were reading an Act of Parliament aloud. "Tell your father whether it was last Monday, Bella." "But we never heard any more of it, Ma," said Bella, the elder girl.
"In addition to which, my dear," her husband urged, "if you have no place to put 2 young persons into—"
"Pardon me," Mrs Wilfer again interposed. "They were not young persons. 2 young ladies of the highest respectability. Tell your father, Bella, whether the milkman said so."
"My dear, it is the same thing."
"No, it is not," said Mrs Wilfer with the same impressive monotony. "Pardon me."
"I mean, my dear, it is the same thing as to space. As to space. If you have no space in which to put 2 youthful fellow creatures, however eminently respectable, which I do not doubt, where are those youthful fellow creatures to be accommodated? I carry it no further than that, and solely looking at it," said her husband, making the stipulation at once in a conciliatory, complimentary, and argumentative tone, "as I am sure you will agree, my love, from a fellow creature point of view, my dear."
"I have nothing more to say," returned Mrs Wilfer, with a meek renunciatory action of her gloves. "It is as you think, R.W., not as I do."
Here the huffing of Miss Bella and the loss of 3 of her men at a swoop, aggravated by the coronation of an opponent, led to that young lady's jerking the draught board and pieces off the table, which her sister went down on her knees to pick up.
"Poor Bella," said Mrs Wilfer.
"And poor Lavinia, perhaps, my dear?" suggested R.W.
"Pardon me," said Mrs Wilfer. "No."
It was one of the worthy woman's specialities that she had an amazing power of gratifying her splenetic or worldly-minded humours by extolling her own family, which she thus proceeded, in the present case, to do.
"No, R.W. Lavinia has not known the trial that Bella has known. The trial that your daughter Bella has undergone is perhaps without a parallel, and has been borne, I will say, nobly. When you see your daughter Bella in her black dress, which she alone of all the family wears, and when you remember the circumstances which have led to her wearing it, and when you know how these circumstances have been sustained, then, R.W., lay your head upon your pillow and say, Poor Lavinia."
Here Miss Lavinia, from her kneeling situation under the table, put in that she didn't want to be poored by Pa, or anybody else.
"I am sure you do not, my dear," returned her mother, "for you have a fine brave spirit, and your sister Cecilia has a fine brave spirit of another kind, a spirit of pure devotion, a beautiful spirit. The self-sacrifice of Cecilia reveals a pure and womanly character very seldom equalled, never surpassed. I have now in my pocket a letter from your sister Cecilia, received this morning, received 3 months after her marriage, poor child, in which she tells me that her husband must unexpectedly shelter under their roof his reduced aunt. But I will be true to him, mamma, she touchingly writes. I will not leave him. I must not forget that he is my husband. let his aunt come. If this is not pathetic, if this is not woman's devotion. The good lady waved her gloves in a sense of the impossibility of saying more, and tied the pocket handkerchief over her head in a tighter knot under her chin. Bella, who was now seated on the rug to warm herself, with her brown eyes on the fire, and a handful of brown curls in her mouth, laughed at this, and then pouted and half cried. 'I am sure,' said she, 'though you have no feeling for me, Pa, I am one of the most unfortunate girls that ever lived. You know how poor we are.' It is probable he did, having some reason to know it. 'And what a glimpse of wealth I had, and how it melted away, and how I am here in this ridiculous mourning, which I hate, a kind of a widow who never was married, and yet you don't feel for me.' 'Yes, you do, yes, you do.' This abrupt change was occasioned by her father's face. She stopped to pull him down from his chair in an attitude highly favourable to strangulation, and to give him a kiss and a pat or two on the cheek. 'But you ought to feel for me, you know, Pa.' 'My dear, I do.' 'Yes, and I say you ought to. If they'd only left me alone and told me nothing about it, it would have mattered much less. But that nasty Mr Lightwood feels it his duty, as he says, to write and tell me what is in reserve for me. And then I am obliged to get rid of George Sampson.' Here Lavinia, rising to the surface with the last draughtman rescued, interposed. 'You never cared for George Sampson, Bella.' 'And did I say I did, miss?' Then pouting again, with the curls in her mouth. 'George Sampson was very fond of me, and admired me very much, and put up with everything I did to him.' 'You were rude enough to him,' Lavinia again interposed. 'And did I say I wasn't, miss? I am not setting up to be sentimental about George Sampson. I only say George Sampson was better than nothing. You didn't show him that you thought even that,' Lavinia again interposed. 'You are a chit and a little idiot,' returned Bella, 'or you wouldn't make such a dolly speech. What did you expect me to do? Wait till you are a woman, and don't talk about what you don't understand. You only show your ignorance.' Then whimpering again, and at intervals biting the curls, and stopping to look how much was bitten off. 'It's a shame. There never was such a hard case. I shouldn't care so much if it wasn't so ridiculous. It was ridiculous enough to have a stranger coming over to marry me, whether he liked it or not. It was ridiculous enough to know what an embarrassing meeting it would be, and how we never could pretend to have an inclination of our own, either of us. It was ridiculous enough to know I shouldn't like him. How could I like him? Left to him in a will, like a dozen spoons, with everything cut and dried beforehand, like orange chips. Talk of orange flowers, indeed! I declare again it's a shame. Those ridiculous points would have been smoothed away by the money. For I love money, and want money, want it dreadfully. I hate to be poor, and we are degradingly poor, offensively poor, miserably poor, beastly poor. But here I am, left with all the ridiculous parts of the situation remaining, and added to them all this ridiculous dress. And if the truth was known, when the Harmon murder was all over the town, and people were speculating on its being suicide, I dare say those impudent wretches at the clubs and places made jokes about the miserable creatures having preferred a watery grave to me. It's likely enough they took such liberties. I shouldn't wonder. I declare it's a very hard case indeed, and I'm a most unfortunate girl. The idea of being a kind of a widow, and never having been married! And the idea of being as poor as ever after all, and going into black besides for a man I never saw, and should have hated as far as he was concerned, if I had seen. The young lady's lamentations were checked at this point by a knuckle-knocking at the half-open door of the room. The knuckle had knocked 2 or 3 times already, but had not been heard. 'Who is it?' said Mrs Wilfer, in her Act of Parliament manner. 'Enter.' A gentleman coming in, Miss Bella, with a short and sharp exclamation, scrambled off the hearthrug and massed the bitten curls together in their right place on her neck. 'The servant girl had her key in the door as I came up, and directed me to this room, telling me I was expected. I'm afraid I should have asked her to announce me.' 'Pardon me,' returned Mrs Wilfer. 'Not at all. 2 of my daughters. R.W. This is the gentleman who has taken your first floor. He was so good as to make an appointment for tonight, when you would be at home.' A dark gentleman, 30 at the utmost, an expressive, one might say handsome face, a very bad manner, in the last degree constrained, reserved, diffident, troubled.
His eyes were on Miss Bella for an instant, and then looked at the ground as he addressed the master of the house. 'Seeing that I am quite satisfied, Mr Wilfer, with the rooms, and with their situation, and with their price, I suppose a memorandum between us of 2 or 3 lines and a payment down will bind the bargain? I wish to send in furniture without delay.' 2 or 3 times during this short address, the cherub addressed had made chubby motions towards a chair. The gentleman now took it, laying a hesitating hand on a corner of the table, and with another hesitating hand lifting the crown of his hat to his lips and drawing it before his mouth. 'The gentleman, R.W.,' said Mrs Wilfer, 'proposes to take your apartments by the quarter. A quarter's notice on either side.' 'Shall I mention, sir,' insinuated the landlord, expecting it to be received as a matter of course, 'the form of a reference?' 'I think,' returned the gentleman after a pause, 'that a reference is not necessary. Neither, to say the truth, is it convenient, for I am a stranger in London. I require no reference from you, and perhaps, therefore, you will require none from me. That will be fair on both sides. Indeed, I show the greater confidence of the two, for I will pay in advance whatever you please, and I am going to trust my furniture here. Whereas, if you were in embarrassed circumstances, this is merely supposititious.' Conscience causing R. Wilfer to colour, Mrs Wilfer from a corner (she always got into stately corners) came to the rescue with a deep-toned 'Perfectly.' 'Why, then, I might lose it.' 'Well,' observed R. Wilfer cheerfully, 'money and goods are certainly the best of references.'
'Do you think they are the best, Pa?' asked Miss Bella in a low voice, and without looking over her shoulder as she warmed her foot on the fender.
'Among the best, my dear.'
'I should have thought myself it was so easy to add the usual kind of one,'
said Bella with a toss of her curls. The gentleman listened to her with a face of marked attention, though he neither looked up nor changed his attitude. He sat, still and silent, until his future landlord accepted his proposals and brought writing materials to complete the business. He sat, still and silent, while the landlord wrote. When the agreement was ready in duplicate, the landlord having worked at it like some cherubic scribe in what is conventionally called a doubtful, which means a not at all doubtful, old master, it was signed by the contracting parties, Bella looking on a scornful witness. The contracting parties were R. Wilfer and John Rokesmith, Esquire. When it came to Bella's turn to sign her name, Mr Rokesmith, who was standing, as he had sat, with a hesitating hand upon the table, looked at her stealthily, but narrowly. He looked at the pretty figure bending down over the paper, and saying,
'Where am I to go, Pa? Here, in this corner?'
He looked at the beautiful brown hair shading the coquettish face. He looked at the free dash of the signature, which was a bold one for a woman's, and then they looked at one another. 'Much obliged to you, Miss Wilfer.'
'Obliged?'
'I have given you so much trouble.'
'Signing my name? Yes, certainly. But I am your landlord's daughter, sir.'
As there was nothing more to do but pay 8 sovereigns in earnest of the bargain, pocket the agreement, appoint a time for the arrival of his furniture and himself, and go, Mr Rokesmith did that, as awkwardly as it might be done, and was escorted by his landlord to the outer air. When R. Wilfer returned, candlestick in hand, to the bosom of his family, he found the bosom agitated.
'Pa,' said Bella, 'we have got a murderer for a tenant.' 'Pa,' said Lavinia, 'we have got a robber.' 'To see him unable for his life to look anybody in the face,' said Bella, 'there never was such an exhibition.'
'My dears,' said their father, 'he is a diffident gentleman, and I should say particularly so in the society of girls of your age.'
'Nonsense, our age!' cried Bella impatiently. 'What's that got to do with him? Besides, we are not of the same age.' 'Which age?' demanded Lavinia. 'Never you mind, Lavvy,' retorted Bella. 'You wait till you are of an age to ask such questions. Pa, mark my words. Between Mr Rokesmith and me there is a natural antipathy and a deep distrust, and something will come of it.'
'My dear and girls,' said the cherub patriarch, 'between Mr Rokesmith and me there is a matter of 8 sovereigns, and something for supper shall come of it, if you will agree upon the article.' This was a neat and happy turn to give the subject, treats being rare in the Wilfer household,
where a monotonous appearance of Dutch cheese at 10 o'clock in the evening had been rather frequently commented on by the dimpled shoulders of Miss Bella. Indeed, the modest Dutchman himself seemed conscious of his want of variety, and generally came before the family in a state of apologetic perspiration. After some discussion on the relative merits of veal cutlet, sweetbread, and lobster, a decision was pronounced in favour of veal cutlet. Mrs Wilfer then solemnly divested herself of her handkerchief and gloves as a preliminary sacrifice to preparing the frying pan, and R.W. himself went out to purchase the viand. He soon returned, bearing the same in a fresh cabbage leaf, where it coyly embraced a rasher of ham. Melodious sounds were not long in rising from the frying pan on the fire, or in seeming, as the firelight danced in the mellow holes of a couple of full bottles on the table, to play appropriate dance music. The cloth was laid by Lavvy. Bella, as the acknowledged ornament of the family, employed both her hands in giving her hair an additional wave, while sitting in the easiest chair, and occasionally threw in a direction touching the supper, as, "Very brown, Ma," or to her sister, "Put the salt cellar straight, miss, and don't be a dowdy little puss." Meantime, her father, chinking Mr Rokesmith's gold as he sat expectant between his knife and fork, remarked that 6 of those sovereigns came just in time for their landlord, and stood them in a little pile on the white tablecloth to look at. "I hate our landlord," said Bella. But, observing a fall in her father's face, she went and sat down by him at the table, and began touching up his hair with the handle of a fork. It was one of the girl's spoilt ways to be always arranging the family's hair, perhaps because her own was so pretty, and occupied so much of her attention. "You deserve to have a house of your own, don't you, poor Pa?" "I don't deserve it better than another, my dear." "At any rate, I, for one, want it more than another," said Bella, holding him by the chin as she stuck his flaxen hair on end. "And I grudge this money going to the monster that swallows up so much, when we all want everything. And if you say, as you want to say, I know you want to say so, Pa, that's neither reasonable nor honest, Bella, then I answer, maybe not, Pa, very likely, but it's one of the consequences of being poor, and of thoroughly hating and detesting to be poor, and that's my case. Now you look lovely, Pa. Why don't you always wear your hair like that? And here's the cutlet. If it isn't very brown, Ma, I can't eat it, and must have a bit put back to be done expressly." However, as it was brown, even to Bella's taste, the young lady graciously partook of it without reconsignment to the frying pan, and also in due course of the contents of the 2 bottles, whereof one held Scotch ale and the other rum. The latter perfume, with the fostering aid of boiling water and lemon peel, diffused itself throughout the room, and became so highly concentrated around the warm fireside, that the wind passing over the house roof must have rushed off charged with a delicious whiff of it, after buzzing like a great bee at that particular chimney-pot. "Pa," said Bella, sipping the fragrant mixture and warming her favourite ankle, "when old Mr Harmon made such a fool of me, not to mention himself, as he is dead, what do you suppose he did it for?" "Impossible to say, my dear. As I have told you time out of number since his will was brought to light, I doubt if I ever exchanged 100 words with the old gentleman. If it was his whim to surprise us, his whim succeeded, for he certainly did it." "And I was stamping my foot and screaming when he first took notice of me, was I?" said Bella, contemplating the ankle before mentioned. "You were stamping your little foot, my dear, and screaming with your little voice, and laying into me with your little bonnet, which you had snatched off for the purpose," returned her father, as if the remembrance gave a relish to the rum. "You were doing this one Sunday morning when I took you out, because I didn't go the exact way you wanted, when the old gentleman, sitting on a seat near, said, 'That's a nice girl, that's a very nice girl, a promising girl.' And so you were, my dear." "And then he asked my name, did he, Pa?" "Then he asked your name, my dear, and mine, and on another Sunday mornings, when we walked his way, we saw him again, and really, that's all." As that was all the rum and water too, or, in other words, as R.W. delicately signified that his glass was empty, by throwing back his head and standing the glass upside down on his nose and upper lip, it might have been charitable in Mrs Wilfer to suggest replenishment, but that heroine briefly suggesting bedtime instead, the bottles were put away, and the family retired. She cherubically escorted, like some severe saint in a painting, or merely human matron allegorically treated.
'And by this time to-morrow,' said Lavinia, when the two girls were alone in their room, 'we shall have Mr Rokesmith here, and shall be expecting to have our throats cut.' 'You needn't stand between me and the candle for all that,' retorted Bella. 'This is another of the consequences of being poor. The idea of a girl with a really fine head of hair having to do it by one flat candle and a few inches of looking-glass. You caught George Sampson with it, Bella, bad as your means of dressing it are.' 'You low little thing! Caught George Sampson with it! Don't talk about catching people, miss, till your own time for catching, as you call it, comes.' 'Perhaps it has come,' muttered Lavvy with a toss of her head. 'What did you say?' asked Bella very sharply. 'What did you say, miss?' Lavvy declining equally to repeat or to explain, Bella gradually lapsed over her hairdressing into a soliloquy on the miseries of being poor, as exemplified in having nothing to put on, nothing to go out in, nothing to dress by, only a nasty box to dress at instead of a commodious dressing-table, and being obliged to take in suspicious lodgers. On the last grievance, as her climax, she laid great stress, and might have laid greater had she known that if Mr Julius Handford had a twin brother upon earth, Mr John Rokesmith was the man. End of Book 1, Chapter 4. Our Mutual Friend, by Charles Dickens. Book 1, The Cup and the Lip. Chapter 5, Boffin's Bower. Over against a London house, a corner house not far from Cavendish Square, a man with a wooden leg had sat for some years, with his remaining foot in a basket in cold weather, picking up a living on this wise. Every morning at 8 o'clock he stumped to the corner, carrying a chair, a clothes-horse, a pair of trestles, a board, a basket, and an umbrella, all strapped together. Separating these, the board and trestles became a counter, the basket supplied the few small lots of fruit and sweets that he offered for sale upon it, and became a foot-warmer. The unfolded clothes-horse displayed a choice collection of halfpenny ballads, and became a screen, and the stool planted within it became his post for the rest of the day. All weathers saw the man at the post. This is to be accepted in a double sense, for he contrived a back to his wooden stool by placing it against the lamp-post. When the weather was wet, he put up his umbrella over his stock-in-trade, not over himself. When the weather was dry, he furled that faded article, tied it round with a piece of yarn, and laid it crosswise under the trestles, where it looked like an unwholesomely forced lettuce that had lost in colour and crispness what it had gained in size. He had established his right to the corner by imperceptible prescription. He had never varied his ground an inch, but had in the beginning diffidently taken the corner upon which the side of the house gave. A howling corner in the winter time, a dusty corner in the summer time, an undesirable corner at the best of times. Shelterless fragments of straw and paper got up revolving storms there when the main street was at peace, and the water-cart, as if it were drunk or short-sighted, came blundering and jolting round it, making it muddy when all else was clean. On the front of his sailboard hung a little placard, like a kettle-holder, bearing the inscription in his own small text: "Errands gone, on with Phi, Delity by, ladies and gentlemen, I remain your humble servant, Silas Wegg." He had not only settled it with himself in course of time that he was errand-goer by appointment to the house at the corner, though he received such commissions not half a dozen times in a year, and then only as some servant's deputy, but also that he was one of the house's retainers, and owed vassalage to it, and was bound to leal and loyal interest in it. For this reason he always spoke of it as our house, and, though his knowledge of its affairs was mostly speculative and all wrong, claimed to be in its confidence. On similar grounds he never beheld an inmate at any one of its windows but he touched his hat. Yet he knew so little about the inmates that he gave them names of his own invention, as Miss Elizabeth, Master George, Aunt Jane, Uncle Parker, having no authority whatever for any such designations, but particularly the last, to which, as a natural consequence, he stuck with great obstinacy. Over the house itself he exercised the same imaginary powers as over its inhabitants and their affairs. He had never been in it. The length of a piece of fat black water-pipe which trailed itself over the area door into a damp stone passage, and had rather the air of a leech on the house that had taken wonderfully, but this was no impediment to his arranging it according to a plan of his own. It was a great dingy house, with a quantity of dim side window and blank back premises,
and it cost his mind a world of trouble so to lay it out as to account for everything in its external appearance. But, this once done, was quite satisfactory, and he rested persuaded that he knew his way about the house blindfold. From the barred garrets in the high roof to the 2 iron extinguishers before the main door, which seemed to request all lively visitors to have the kindness to put themselves out before entering. Assuredly, this stall of Silas Wegg's was the hardest little stall of all the sterile little stalls in London. It gave you the face-ache to look at his apples, the stomach-ache to look at his oranges, the toothache to look at his nuts. Of the latter commodity he had always a grim little heap, on which lay a little wooden measure which had no discernible inside, and was considered to represent the penneth appointed by Magna Carta. Whether from too much east wind or no, it was an easterly corner. The stall, the stock, and the keeper were all as dry as the desert. Wegg was a knotty man, and a close-grained, with a face carved out of very hard material, that had just as much play of expression as a watchman's rattle. When he laughed, certain jerks occurred in it, and the rattle sprung. Sooth to say, he was so wooden a man that he seemed to have taken his wooden leg naturally, and rather suggested to the fanciful observer that he might be expected, if his development received no untimely check, to be completely set up with a pair of wooden legs in about 6 months. Mr Wegg was an observant person, or, as he himself said, took a powerful sight of notice. He saluted all his regular passers-by every day, as he sat on his stool backed up by the lamp-post, and on the adaptable character of these salutes he greatly plumed himself. Thus to the rector he addressed a bow, compounded of lay deference, and a slight touch of the shady preliminary meditation at church. To the doctor, a confidential bow, as to a gentleman whose acquaintance with his inside he begged respectfully to acknowledge, before the quality he delighted to abase himself, and for Uncle Parker, who was in the army, at least so he had settled it, he put his open hand to the side of his hat in a military manner which that angry-eyed, buttoned-up, inflammatory-faced old gentleman appeared but imperfectly to appreciate. The only article in which Silas dealt that was not hard was gingerbread. On a certain day, some wretched infant having purchased the damp gingerbread horse, fearfully out of condition, and the adhesive bird-cage which had been exposed for the day's sale, he had taken a tin box from under his stool to produce a relay of those dreadful specimens, and was going to look in at the lid, when he said to himself, pausing, "Oh, here you are again." The words referred to a broad, round-shouldered, one-sided old fellow in mourning, coming comically ambling towards the corner, dressed in a pea overcoat and carrying a large stick. He wore thick shoes, and thick leather gaiters, and thick gloves like a hedger's. Both as to his dress and to himself, he was of an overlapping rhinoceros build, with folds in his cheeks and his forehead, and his eyelids and his lips and his ears, but with bright, eager, childishly inquiring grey eyes under his ragged eyebrows and broad-brimmed hat. A very odd-looking old fellow altogether. "Here you are again," repeated Mr Wegg, musing. "And what are you now? Are you in the funds, or where are you? Have you lately come to settle in this neighbourhood, or do you own to another neighbourhood? Are you in independent circumstances, or is it wasting the motions of a bow on you? Come, I'll speculate. I'll invest a bow in you." Which Mr Wegg, having replaced his tin box, accordingly did, as he rose to bait his gingerbread trap for some other devoted infant. The salute was acknowledged with, "Morning, sir, morning, morning." "Calls me sir," said Mr Wegg to himself. "He won't answer. A bow gone. Morning, morning, morning." "Appears to be rather a hearty old cock too," said Mr Wegg as before. "Good morning to you, sir." "Do you remember me then?" asked his new acquaintance, stopping in his amble one-sided before the stall, and speaking in a pounding way, though with great good humour. "I have noticed you go past our house, sir, several times in the course of the last week or so." "Our house," repeated the other. "Meaning?" "Yes," said Mr Wegg, nodding as the other pointed the clumsy forefinger of his right glove at the corner house. "Oh, now what?" pursued the old fellow in an inquisitive manner, carrying his knotted stick in his left arm as if it were a baby. "What do they allow you now?" "It's job work that I do for our house," returned Silas dryly and with reticence. "It's not yet brought to an exact allowance." "Oh, it's not yet brought to an exact allowance? No, it's not yet brought to an exact allowance. Oh, morning, morning, morning." "Appears to be rather a cracked old cock," thought Silas, qualifying his former good opinion as the other ambled off. But, in a moment, he was back again with the question. How did you get your wooden leg? Mr Wegg replied tartly to this personal inquiry, in an accident. Do you like it? Well, I haven't got to keep it warm, Mr Wegg made answer in a sort of desperation occasioned by the singularity of the question. He hasn't, repeated the other to his knotted stick as he gave it a hug. He hasn't got to keep it warm. Did you ever hear of the name of Boffin? No, said Mr Wegg, who was growing restive under this examination. I never did hear the name of Boffin. Do you like it? Why, no, retorted Mr Wegg, again approaching desperation. I can't say I do. Why don't you like it? I don't know why I don't, retorted Mr Wegg, approaching frenzy, but I don't at all. Now, I'll tell you something that'll make you sorry for that, said the stranger, smiling. My name's Boffin. I can't help it, returned Mr Wegg, implying in his manner the offensive addition. And if I could, I wouldn't. But there's another chance for you, said Mr Boffin, smiling still. Do you like the name of Nicodemus? Think it over, Nick or Noddy? It is not, sir, Mr Wegg rejoined as he sat down on his stool with an air of gentle resignation, combined with melancholy candour. It is not a name as I could wish anyone that I had a respect for to call me by. But there may be persons that would not view it with the same objections. I don't know why, Mr Wegg added, anticipating another question. Noddy Boffin, said that gentleman. Noddy, that's my name. Noddy or Nick Boffin. What's your name? Silas Wegg. I don't, said Mr Wegg, bestirring himself to take the same precaution as before. I don't know why Silas, and I don't know why Wegg. Now, Wegg, said Mr Boffin, hugging his stick closer, I want to make a sort of offer to you. Do you remember when you first see me? The wooden Wegg looked at him with a meditative eye, and also with a softened air, as descrying possibility of profit. Let me think. I ain't quite sure, and yet I generally take a powerful sight of notice too. Was it on a Monday morning, when the butcher boy had been to our house for orders and bought a ballad of me, which, being unacquainted with the tune, I run it over to him? Right, Wegg, right. But he bought more than one. Yes, to be sure, sir, he bought several. And wishing to lay out his money to the best, he took my opinion to guide his choice, and we went over the collection together. To be sure we did. Here was him as it might be, and here was myself as it might be, and there was you, Mr Boffin, as you identically are, with your self-same stick under your very same arm, and your very same back towards us. To be sure, added Mr Wegg, looking a little round Mr Boffin to take him in the rear and identify this last extraordinary coincidence. Your very self-same back. What do you think I was doing, Wegg? I should judge, sir, that you might be glancing your eye down the street. No, Wegg, I was a-listening. Was you indeed? Said Mr Wegg, dubiously. Not in a dishonourable way, Wegg, because you were singing to the butcher, and you wouldn't sing secrets to a butcher in the street, you know. It never happened that I did so yet, to the best of my remembrance, said Mr Wegg, cautiously. But I might do it. A man can't say what he might wish to do some day or another. This not to release any little advantage he might derive from Mr Boffin's avowal. Well, repeated Boffin, I was a-listening to you and to him. And what do you haven't got another stool, have you? I'm rather thick in me breath. I haven't got another, but you're welcome to this, said Wegg, resigning it. It's a treat to me to stand. Lord! Exclaimed Mr Boffin, in a tone of great enjoyment, as he settled himself down, still nursing his stick like a baby. It's a pleasant place, this, and then to be shut in on each side with these ballads like so many book-leaf blinkers. Why, it's delightful. If I'm not mistaken, sir, Mr Wegg delicately hinted, resting a hand on his stall and bending over the discursive Boffin, you alluded to some offer or another that was in your mind. I'm coming to it. All right, I'm coming to it. I was going to say that when I listened that morning, I listened with admiration amounting to awe. I thought to myself, here's a man with a wooden leg, a literary man with... Not exactly so, sir, said Mr Wegg. Why, you know every one of these songs by name and by tune, and if you want to read or sing any one on him, off straight, you've only to whip on your spectacles and do it, cried Mr Boffin. I see you at it. Well, sir, returned Mr Wegg with a conscious inclination of the head, we'll
Say literary, then.
A literary man, with a wooden leg, and all print is open to him. That's what I thought to myself that morning,' pursued Mr Boffin, leaning forward to describe, uncramped by the clothes horse, as large an arc as his right arm could make. 'All print is open to him. And it is, ain't it?'
'Why, truly, sir,' Mr Wegg admitted with modesty, 'I believe you couldn't show me the piece of English print that I wouldn't be equal to collaring and throwing.'
'On the spot?'
said Mr Boffin. 'On the spot.' 'I knowed it. Then consider this. Here am I, a man without a wooden leg, and yet all print is shut to me.' 'Indeed, sir,' Mr Wegg returned with increasing self-complacency. 'Education neglected?'
'Neglected,' repeated Boffin with emphasis. 'That ain't no word for it. I don't mean to say, but what if you showed me a B, I could so far give you change for it as to answer Boffin.'
'Come, come, sir,' said Mr Wegg, throwing in a little encouragement. 'That's something, too.'
'It's something,' answered Mr Boffin, 'but I'll take my oath it ain't much.'
'Perhaps it's not as much as could be wished by an inquiring mind, sir,' Mr Wegg admitted.
'Now, look here. I'm retired from business. Me and Mrs Boffin, Henrietty Boffin, which her father's name was Henry and her mother's name was Etty, and so you get it. We live on a compittance under the will of a diseased governor.'
'Gentleman dead, sir?'
'Man alive! Don't I tell you? A diseased governor. Now, it's too late for me to begin shovelling and sifting at alphabets and grammar books. I'm getting to be an old bird. I want to take it easy, but I want some reading, some fine, bold reading, some splendid book in a gorging Lord Mayor's show of volumes,' probably meaning gorgeous, but misled by association of ideas, "as'll reach right down your pint of view and take time to go by you. How can I get that reading, Wegg? By,' tapping him on the breast with the head of his thick stick, "paying a man truly qualified to do it. So much an hour, say twopence, to come and do it."
'Flattered, sir, I'm sure,' said Wegg, beginning to regard himself in quite a new light. 'Whew! This is the offer you mentioned, sir?'
'Yes. Do you like it?'
'I am considering of it, Mr Boffin.' 'I don't,' said Boffin in a free-handed manner, 'want to tie a literary man with a wooden leg down too tight. A halfpenny an hour shan't part us. The hour's your own to choose. After you've done for the day with your house here, I live over Maiden Lane way, out Holloway direction, and you've only got to go east and by north when you've finished here, and you're there. Twopence halfpenny an hour,' said Boffin, taking a piece of chalk from his pocket and getting off the stool to work the sum on the top of it in his own way. 2 long 'uns and a short 'un. Twopence halfpenny. 2 shut 'uns is a long 'un, and two long 'uns is 4 long 'uns, making 5 long 'uns, 6 nights a week at 5 long 'uns a night, scoring them all down separately, and you mount up to 30 long 'uns, a round 'un, half a crown. Pointing to this result as a large and satisfactory one, Mr Boffin smeared it out with his moistened glove and sat down on the remains. 'Half a crown,' said Wegg, meditating. 'Yes, it ain't much, sir, half a crown.'
'Per week, you know.'
'Per week? Yes. As to the amount of strain upon the intellect now, was you thinking at all of poetry?' Mr Wegg inquired, musing.
'Would it come dearer?'
Mr Boffin asked. 'It would come dearer,' Mr Wegg returned, 'for when a person comes to grind off poetry night after night, it is but right he should expect to be paid for its weakening effect on his mind.'
'To tell you the truth, Wegg,' said Boffin, 'I wasn't thinking of poetry, except in so far as this. If you was to happen now and then to feel yourself in the mind to tip me and Mrs Boffin one of your ballads, why then we should drop into poetry.'
'I follow you, sir,' said Wegg, 'but not being a regular musical professional, I should be loath to engage myself for that, and therefore when I dropped into poetry, I should ask to be considered so for in the light of a friend.' At this Mr Boffin's eyes sparkled, and he shook Silas earnestly by the hand, protesting that it was more than he could have asked, and that he took it very kindly indeed.
'What do you think of the terms, Wegg?' Mr Boffin then demanded with unconcealed anxiety.
Silas, who had stimulated this anxiety by his hard reserve of manner, and who had begun to understand his man very well, replied with an air as if he were saying something extraordinarily generous and great, 'Mr Boffin, I never bargain.'
'So I should have thought of you,' said Mr Boffin admiringly.
'No, sir, I never did haggle, and I never will haggle. Consequently, I meet you at once, free and fair, with done for double the money.'
Mr Boffin seemed a little unprepared for this conclusion, but assented with the remark,
'You know better what it ought to be than I do, Wegg,'
and again shook hands with him upon it.
'Could you begin tonight, Wegg?'
he then demanded.
'Yes, sir,'
said Mr Wegg, carefully to leave all the eagerness to him.
'I see no difficulty, if you wish it. You're provided with the needful implement. A book, sir?'
'Bought him at a sale,' said Mr Boffin. 8 volumes, red and gold, purple ribbon in every volume to keep the place where you leave off. Do you know him?'
'The book's name, sir?' inquired Silas.
'I thought you might have knowed him without it,' said Mr Boffin, slightly disappointed.
'His name is Decline and Fall Off the Russian Empire.'
Mr Boffin went over these stones slowly and with much caution.
'Aye, indeed,' said Mr Wegg,
nodding his head with an air of friendly recognition.
'You know him, Wegg?'
'I haven't been, not to say right slap through him very lately,' Mr Wegg made answer, 'having been otherwise employed, Mr Boffin. But know him? Old familiar declining and falling off the Russian? Rather, sir. Ever since I was not so high as your stick. Ever since my eldest brother left our cottage to enlist into the army, on which occasion, as the ballad that was made about it describes, beside that cottage door, Mr Boffin, a girl was on her knees. She held aloft a snowy scarf, sir, which, my eldest brother noticed, fluttered in the breeze. She breathed a prayer for him, Mr Boffin, a prayer he could not hear, and my eldest brother leaned upon his sword, Mr Boffin, and wiped away a tear.'
Much impressed by this family circumstance, and also by the friendly disposition of Mr Wegg, as exemplified in his so soon dropping into poetry, Mr Boffin again shook hands with that ligneous sharper, and besought him to name his hour. Mr Wegg named 8.
'Where I live,' said Mr Boffin, 'is called the Bower. Boffin's Bower is the name Mrs Boffin christened it when we came into it as a property. If you should meet with anybody that don't know it by that name, which hardly anybody does, when you've got nigh upon about a odd mile or say and a quarter if you like up Maiden Lane, Battle Bridge, ask for Harmony Jail, and you'll be put right. I shall expect you, Wegg,' said Mr Boffin, clapping him on the shoulder with the greatest enthusiasm, 'most joyfully. I shall have no peace or patience till you come. Print is now opening ahead of me. This night, a literary man with a wooden leg.' He bestowed an admiring look upon that decoration, as if it greatly enhanced the relish of Mr Wegg's attainments. 'Will begin to lead me a new life. My fist again, Wegg. Morning, morning, morning.'
Left alone at his stall, as the other ambled off, Mr Wegg subsided into his screen, produced a small pocket handkerchief of a penitentially scrubbing character, and took himself by the nose with a thoughtful aspect. Also, while he still grasped that feature, he directed several thoughtful looks down the street after the retiring figure of Mr Boffin. But profound gravity sat enthroned on Wegg's countenance. For, while he considered within himself that this was an old fellow of rare simplicity, that this was an opportunity to be improved, and that here might be money to be got beyond present calculation, still he compromised himself by no admission that his new engagement was at all out of his way or involved the least element of the ridiculous. Mr Wegg would even have picked a handsome quarrel with any one who should have challenged his deep acquaintance with those aforesaid 8 volumes of Decline and Fall. His gravity was unusual, portentous, and immeasurable, not because he admitted any doubt of himself, but because he perceived it necessary to forestall any doubt of himself in others. And herein he ranged with that very numerous class of impostors who are quite as determined to keep up appearances to themselves as to their neighbours. A certain loftiness, likewise, took possession of Mr Wegg, a condescending sense of being in request as an official expounder of mysteries. It did not move him to commercial greatness, but rather to littleness, insomuch that if it had been within the possibilities of things for the wooden measure to hold fewer nuts than usual, it would have done so that day. But when night came, and with her veiled eyes beheld him stumping towards Boffin's Bower, he was elated too. The Bower was as difficult to find as Fair Rosamond's without the clue.
Mr Wegg, having reached the quarter indicated, inquired for the Bower half a dozen times without the least success, until he remembered to ask for Harmony Jail. This occasioned a quick change in the spirits of a horse gentleman and a donkey, whom he had much perplexed.
"Why, you mean Old Harmon's, do you?"
said the horse gentleman, who was driving his donkey in a truck with a carrot for a whip.
"Why didn't you never say so? Eddard and me is a-going by him. Jump in."
Mr Wegg complied, and the horse gentleman invited his attention to the third person in company thus.
"Now, you look at Eddard's ears. What was it as you named again? Whisper."
Mr Wegg whispered,
"Boffin's Bower." "Eddard, keep your eye on his ears. Cut away to Boffin's Bower."
Eddard, with his ears lying back, remained immovable.
"Eddard, keep your eye on his ears. Cut away to Old Harmon's."
Edward instantly pricked up his ears to their utmost, and rattled off at such a pace that Mr Wegg's conversation was jolted out of him in a most dislocated state.
"Was it ever a jail?"
asked Mr Wegg, holding on.
"Not a proper jail, what you and me will get committed to," returned his escort. "They'd give it the name on accounts of Old Harmon living solitary there." "And why did they call it Harmony?" asked Wegg. "On accounts of his never agreeing with nobody, like the speeches of chaff. Harmon's jail, Harmony jail, working it round like."
"Do you know Miss Boffin?" asked Wegg.
"I should think so. Everybody do about here. Eddard knows him. Keep your eye on his ears. Noddy Boffin, Eddard."
The effect of the name was so very alarming, in respect of causing a temporary disappearance of Edward's head, casting his hind hoofs in the air, greatly accelerating the pace and increasing the jolting, that Mr Wegg was fain to devote his attention exclusively to holding on, and to relinquish his desire of ascertaining whether his homage to Boffin was to be considered complimentary or the reverse. Presently Edward stopped at a gateway, and Wegg discreetly lost no time in slipping out at the back of the truck. The moment he was landed, his late driver, with a wave of the carrot, said, "Supper, Eddard," and he, the hind hoofs, the truck, and Edward all seemed to fly into the air together in a kind of apotheosis. Pushing the gate, which stood ajar, Wegg looked into an enclosed space where certain tall dark mounds rose high against the sky, and where the pathway to the Bower was indicated, as the moonlight showed between two lines of broken crockery set in ashes. A white figure advancing along this path proved to be nothing more ghostly than Mr Boffin, easily attired for the pursuit of knowledge in an undress garment of short white smock frock. Having received his literary friend with great cordiality, he conducted him to the interior of the Bower, and there presented him to Mrs Boffin. A stout lady, of a rubicund and cheerful aspect, dressed, to Mr Wegg's consternation, in a low evening dress of sable satin and a large black velvet hat and feathers. "Mrs Boffin, Wegg," said Boffin, "is a high flyer at fashion, and her make is such as she does it credit. As to myself, I ain't yet as fashionable as I may come to be. Henrietty, old lady, this is the gentleman that's going to decline and fall off the Rooshan Empire."
"And I'm sure I hope it'll do you both good,"
said Mrs Boffin. It was the queerest of rooms, fitted and furnished more like a luxurious amateur tap-room than anything else within the ken of Silas Wegg. There were two wooden settles by the fire, one on each side of it, with a corresponding table before each. On one of these tables the 8 volumes arranged flat in a row like a galvanic battery. On the other, certain squat case bottles of inviting appearance seemed to stand on tiptoe to exchange glances with Mr Wegg over a front row of tumblers and a basin of white sugar. On the hob a kettle steamed. On the hearth a cat reposed. Facing the fire between the settles, a sofa, a footstool, and a little table formed a centrepiece devoted to Mrs Boffin. They were garish in taste and colour, but were expensive articles of drawing-room furniture that had a very odd look beside the settles and the flaring gaslight pendant from the ceiling. There was a flowery carpet on the floor, but instead of reaching to the fireside, its glowing vegetation stopped short at Mrs Boffin's footstool, and gave place to a region of sand and sawdust. Mr Wegg also noticed with admiring eyes that, while the flowery land displayed such hollow ornamentation as stuffed birds and waxen fruits under glass shades,
There were, in the territory where vegetation ceased, compensatory shelves on which the best part of a large pie, and likewise of a cold joint, were plainly discernible among other solids. The room itself was large, though low, and the heavy frames of its old-fashioned windows and the heavy beams in its crooked ceiling seemed to indicate that it had once been a house of some mark, standing alone in the country.
Do you like it, Wegg?
Asked Mr Boffin, in his pouncing manner.
I admire it greatly, sir, said Wegg. Peculiar comfort at this fireside, sir.
Do you understand it, Wegg?
Why, in a general way, sir.
Mr Wegg was beginning slowly and knowingly with his head stuck on one side, as evasive people do begin, when the other cut him short.
You don't understand it, Wegg, and I'll explain it. These arrangements is made by mutual consent between Mrs Boffin and me. Mrs Boffin, as I have mentioned, is a high flyer at fashion. At present, I'm not. I don't go higher than comfort, and comfort of the sort that I'm equal to the enjoyment of. Well then, where would be the good of Mrs Boffin and me quarrelling over it? We never did quarrel before we came into Boffin's Bower as a property. Why quarrel when we have come into Boffin's Bower as a property? So, Mrs Boffin, she keeps up her part of the room in her way, I keep up my part of the room in mine, in consequence of which we have at once sociability. I should go melancholy and mad without Mrs Boffin. Fashion and comfort. If I get by degrees to be a higher flyer at fashion, then Mrs Boffin will by degrees come forwarder. If Mrs Boffin should ever be less of a dab at fashion than she is at the present time, then Mrs Boffin's carpet would go back harder. If we should both continue as we are, why then here we are, and give us a kiss, old lady.
Mrs Boffin, who, perpetually smiling, had approached and drawn her plump arm through her lord's, most willingly complied. Fashion, in the form of her black velvet hat and feathers, tried to prevent it, but got deservedly crushed in the endeavour. So now, Wegg, said Boffin, wiping his mouth with an air of much refreshment, you begin to know us as we are. This is a charming spot, is the Bower, but you must get to appreciate it by degrees. It's a spot to find out the merits of, little by little, and a new one every day. There's a serpentining walk up each of the mounds that gives you the yard and neighbourhood changing every moment. When you get to the top, there's a view of the neighbouring premises, not to be surpassed. The premises of Mrs Boffin's late father, Canine Provision Trade, you look down into, as if it were your own. And the top of the high mound is crowned with a lattice-work arbour, in which, if you don't read out loud many a book in the summer, I, and as a friend, drop many a time into poetry too, it shan't be my fault. Now, what'll you read on?
Thank you, sir, returned Wegg, as if there were nothing new in his reading at all. I generally do it on gin and water.
Keeps the organ moist, does it, Wegg? Asked Mr Boffin, with innocent eagerness.
No, sir, replied Wegg coolly. I should hardly describe it so, sir. I should say mellows it. Mellows it is the word I should employ, Mr Boffin.
His wooden conceit and craft kept exact pace with the delighted expectation of his victim. The visions rising before his mercenary mind of the many ways in which this connection was to be turned to account, never obscured the foremost idea natural to a dull overreaching man, that he must not make himself too cheap. Mrs Boffin's fashion, as a less inexorable deity than the idol usually worshipped under that name, did not forbid her mixing for her literary guest, or asking if he found the result to his liking. On his returning a gracious answer, and taking his place at the literary settle, Mr Boffin began to compose himself as a listener at the opposite settle with exultant eyes.
Sorry to deprive you of a pipe, Wegg, he said, filling his own, but you can't do both together. Oh, and another thing I forgot to name. When you come in here of an evening, and look round you, and notice anything on a shelf that happens to catch your fancy, mention it.
Wegg, who had been going to put on his spectacles, immediately laid them down, with the sprightly observation,
You read my thoughts, sir. Do my eyes deceive me, or is that object up there a pie? It can't be a pie.
Yes, it's a pie, Wegg, replied Mr Boffin, with a glance of some little discomfiture at the decline and fall.
Have I lost my smell for fruits, or is it an apple pie, sir?
Asked Wegg. It's a veal and ham pie, said Mr Boffin.
Is it indeed, sir? And it would be hard, sir, to name the pie that is a better pie than a wheel and hammer, said Mr Wegg, nodding his head emotionally.
Have some, Wegg?
Thank you, Mr Boffin. I think I will, at your invitation. I wouldn't at any other parties at the present juncture, but at yours, sir. And meat jelly too, especially when a little salt, which is the case where there's ham, is mellowing to the organ. Is very mellowing to the organ.
Mr Wegg did not say what organ, but spoke with a cheerful generality. So the pie was brought down, and the worthy Mr Boffin exercised his patience until Wegg, in the exercise of his knife and fork, had finished the dish, only profiting by the opportunity to inform Wegg that although it was not strictly fashionable to keep the contents of a larder thus exposed to view, he, Mr Boffin, considered it hospitable, for the reason that instead of saying in a comparatively unmeaning manner to a visitor, "There are such and such edibles downstairs, will you have anything up?" you took the bold practical course of saying, "Cast your eye along the shelves, and if you see anything you like there, have it down." And now Mr Wegg at length pushed away his plate and put on his spectacles, and Mr Boffin lighted his pipe and looked with beaming eyes into the opening world before him, and Mrs Boffin reclined in a fashionable manner on her sofa, as one who would be part of the audience if she found she could, and would go to sleep if she found she couldn't.
Ahem,
began Wegg.
This, Mr Boffin and lady, is the first chapter of the first volume of the Decline and Fall of...
Here he looked hard at the book and stopped. "What's the matter, Wegg?"
Why, it comes into my mind, you know, sir,
said Wegg with an air of insinuating frankness, having first again looked hard at the book,
that you made a little mistake this morning, which I had meant to set you right in, only something put it out of my head. I think you said Russian Empire, sir.
"It is Russian, ain't it, Wegg?"
"No, sir. Roman. Roman."
"What's the difference, Wegg?"
"The difference, sir..."
Mr Wegg was faltering and in danger of breaking down, when a bright thought flashed upon him.
"The difference, sir... There you place me in a difficulty, Mr Boffin. Suffice it to observe that the difference is best postponed to some other occasion when Mrs Boffin does not honour us with her company. In Mrs Boffin's presence, sir, we had better drop it."
Mr Wegg thus came out of his disadvantage with quite a chivalrous air, and not only that, but by dint of repeating with a manly delicacy,
"In Mrs Boffin's presence, sir, we had better drop it,"
turned the disadvantage on Boffin, who felt that he had committed himself in a very painful manner. Then Mr Wegg, in a dry unflinching way, entered on his task, going straight across country at everything that came before him, taking all the hard words, biographical and geographical, getting rather shaken by Hadrian, Trajan, and the Antonines, stumbling at Polybius, pronounced Polybius, and supposed by Mr Boffin to be a Roman virgin, and by Mrs Boffin to be responsible for that necessity of dropping it, heavily unseated by Titus Antoninus Pius, up again and galloping smoothly with Augustus, finally getting over the ground well with Commodus, who, under the appellation of Commodius, was held by Mr Boffin to have been quite unworthy of his English origin, and not to have acted up to his name in his government of the Roman people. With the death of this personage, Mr Wegg terminated his first reading, long before which consummation several total eclipses of Mrs Boffin's candle behind her black velvet disc would have been very alarming, but for being regularly accompanied by a potent smell of burnt pens when her feathers took fire, which acted as a restorative and woke her. Mr Wegg, having read on by rote and attached as few ideas as possible to the text, came out of the encounter fresh. But Mr Boffin, who had soon laid down his unfinished pipe, and had ever since sat intently staring with his eyes and mind at the confounding enormities of the Romans, was so severely punished that he could hardly wish his literary friend good night, and articulate tomorrow.
"Commodious!"
gasped Mr Boffin, staring at the moon, after letting Wegg out at the gate and fastening it.
"Commodious fights in that wild beast show 735 times in one character only. As if that wasn't stunning enough, 100 lions is turned into the same wild beast show all at once. As if that wasn't stunning enough, Commodious in another character kills them all off in 100 goes. And as if that wasn't stunning enough, Vitellus, and well named too, eats 6 millions worth, English money, in 7 months. Wegg takes it easy. Upon my soul, to an old bird like myself, these are scarers. And even now that Commodious is strangled, I don't see a way to our bettering ourselves."
Mr Boffin added, as he turned his pensive steps towards the bower and shook his head, "I didn't think this morning there was half so many scarers in print, but I'm in for it now." End of Book 1, Chapter 5.